All the great powers of 6 great gods and heroes have been gathered together and placed in the hands of boy broadcaster Billy Batson. When he pronounces the name of the ancient Egyptian wizard Shazam, he becomes, in a blinding flash of lightning, Captain Marvel, the world's mightiest mortal. Then, when evil is defeated, Captain Marvel repeats the word and changes back to Billy. So amazing and sudden is the change that most people never realize what has happened. This is Comic Geek Speak episode 1737, Spotlight on SHAZAM in the Bronze Age.
Part 1.
I'm Adam Murdo.
I'm Ian Levinstein.
And I'm Chris Eberly. Ah, Murd, what an intro. That was legendary.
Thank you, Chris. It's patterned. Well, it's patterned on your intros for your various Spotlight episodes.
Which I always have you read, sir, because you have the most sonorous voice.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's shamelessly derivative. So there. Shamelessly derivative of the true Sultan of Spotlights, Chris Eber.
Well, I'm working on one, but right now we're basking in the one you just prepared. Let me tell the audience, I'm looking at your notes. Fantastic detail, Murd.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's just
be fun.
Trying to just provide enough detail to be interesting without disappearing down a rabbit's hole of hyper detail.
I think you thread that needle. I don't think we need to make this, turgid.
Oh, so. Yeah. I'm bound and determined, guys, to get through this era of Captain Marvel history in a single episode, and I think we're going to succeed too, because there's like a fraction of the material to get through for the era of 1973 to 1985, which is what we'll be covering, as compared to like 1940 to 1954. Which took us 4 episodes.
Well, I got to tell you, there's something fitting about this ending a year after my birth, considering that this is my first spotlight to be a part of here on Comic Geek Speak. So, slightly after the age of Levinstein, this spotlight on the Bronze Age ends, and I approve of that.
The age of Levinstein.
That has got a heck of a ring to it.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I got a little
applaud you for this milestone, too. Your first Spotlight episode as a CGSer.
Yep, and I am happy to be, as I affectionately called it in the pre-show, the pants seat, where I'll be asking the questions and interjecting with random comments here or there, as I am not at all familiar with anything that we're discussing on this episode, but I kind of like it that way.
Oh, Ian, I'm right there with you. This is Murd's wheelhouse, and I also have a lot of questions looking forward to posing.
Preserving the mystery here. It's like we're all opening an ancient Egyptian temple together. Exploring its wonders.
Although, hopefully it'll be a better movie than The Scorpion King.
Probably. Although, I'm pretty sure that the Black Adam movie will eventually be a better Dwayne Johnson movie than The Scorpion King was, too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it.
All right, so, and I appreciate you guys occupying the pants seat, because, as we were saying before we began recording here, Pants was always one to downplay the importance of what he tended to do in episodes like this.
Vitally important.
Yep.
For the main lector, as Chris knows, as he's been in that position many, many a time, it's very, very helpful when his castmates chime in to volunteer information or to ask questions. So, for the love of all the elders, guys, if at any point during this my ensuing lengthy ramble, you guys have pieces of information you want to interject, or some piece of information you want to try to tease out of my beleaguered brain, please do speak up.
Honored, my friend.
Sounds good to me, sir.
And we should remind the listeners that there's a whole series of Shazam spotlights that you can go back into our archives for. Murd did a series on the Golden Age and the Silver Age.
Yep.
So,
well, technically it was the Atomic Age.
The Atomic Age. I'm sorry. You're sorry.
The years
because he wasn't really in the Silver Age. So,
yes, as we will see in a moment. I do have a couple of notes about what was happening to Captain Marvel while he was in hibernation, or to him, around him, adjacent to him, stuff like that. While he was and the Marvel family were in hibernation during the 60s. Well, we'll get some stuff about that. Let me begin by giving credit where credit is due. A lot of the bits of information, especially of a background nature that I'll be revealing in this episode, comes from an article in issue number 93 of Back Issue Magazine, published by Tomorrow's Publishing. That was the All Captains issue, published in 2016. The article is by a fan scholar named John Pierce, and it's the cover story Shazam in the Bronze Age, under a cover by Dave Cockrum.
I remember that issue fondly, yep.
So thanks to Mr. Yep, there's lots of interesting Captain stuff, including that other Captain Marvel, who's actually allowed to use the name. So yes, an excellent issue in a series, a magazine that provides nothing but excellent ishes.
Oh, amen to that. And I have to shout it out now. We'll give context later. Split! Okay, sorry. Had to do that.
Nice.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. That was necessary.
And I want to point out that so it's episode 1538 for Shazam and the Golden Age Part 1. 1540 for Shazam and the Golden Age Part 2, and then we go to scrolling up. Spotlight on Shazam and the Golden Age Part 3 is 1646, and the Atomic Age episode 1699.
Yes, that's a lot of hours of listening there, folks. But to be fair, there were a lot of Captain Marvel stories published in the 40s and 50s. So.
Yes, indeed.
Yep, we'll exercise a little more brevity here in this episode and in the one or ones that will follow. But per Spotlight tradition, as again established by Professor Eberly, let's begin here by sharing whatever thoughts and impressions we may have about this period of Shazam history. And for me, when I think of Captain Marvel in the 70s, I think of the random issues of the Shazam series published by DC that I saw scattered around various yard sales, garage sales, and flea markets that I used to attend with my dad, who's kind of a veteran pack rat and haunts all kinds of estate sales and flea markets and things, looking for his own kind of treasures. When I started collecting comics in the early 90s, I started going with him, and I saw some issues of Shazam, and I saw that red suit with a yellow lightning bolt on it, and thinking I wasn't very clear on who the original Captain Marvel was at that point. I hadn't started reading Jerry Ordway's Power of Shazam series yet, about which we will hear a lot more in a future Spotlight on Shazam episode, believe you me. But just looking at those 70s comics, they looked like fairly simple, wholesome, kid-friendly comics entertainment. And having read all of them now, I find that I was not far wrong with that assumption. And I can throw into that now, though, having read the other half of the Bronze Age for Captain Marvel after the Shazam title series petered out and was replaced by a backup series in World's Finest Comics. I can also say that the 70s were kind of a time when Captain Marvel grew up a little bit under the pen of writer E. Nelson Bridwell and the artwork of fan favorite Don Newton. We'll hear a little more about him as the episode progresses, too. But it was Captain Marvel's clash with 1970s, then contemporary sensitivities. And he walked away from that collision with only one or two minor scratches. I'd seen a couple of random images from that Bridwell and Newton backup run in the World's Finest during the early days of the internet. I think one of my very first web browsing sessions involved me searching for stuff about Captain Marvel, having by then started to read The Power of Shazam, and I saw a couple of Don Newton's panels, and I thought, wow, okay, that's what the slightly more mature 70s Captain Marvel looked like. And so now I'm just happy to have become fully acquainted, on a crippling level of detail, with all of this stuff, and I'm very pleased to be sharing my findings with everyone in this episode. All right, so how about you guys? Any initial thoughts about Captain Marvel of the 70s?
Ian, go ahead.
This Captain Marvel is a character that in many ways is a blind spot to me. While I was, familiar with him through his appearances specifically in, say, like much later on in Jeff Johns' JSA and stuff like that. I knew that the character existed, and I knew that he had a long storied history, a tumultuous one at that, in the world of comic books, but I really didn't know much about, where that history led him, nor the issues itself. And through the use of your, meticulous note-taking, Murd, I was able to read a couple of issues from that era, and I appreciate the fact that in some ways the Bronze Age feels very, golden. Just in the fact that it really it still has a at least a personality to it, to me, that I equate more with the golden age of comics. Whether it be in campiness, or whether it just be in dialogue choices or in style. I gathered that it may have just been that from what I read, it was mainly the world's finest stuff. Definitely had that appeal and personality to it. But then again, when I think of Shazam, I think of gee whiz and stuff like that. So it very much plays with that character and personality. I'll also say that. And I mean, we'll get to it more later when you actually touch on it, Murd. But now that I've read at least a little bit of All-Star Squadron, I think I'm going to have to read all of All-Star Squadron, because that 100% gels with my style and personality when it comes to reading comics. I adored what I read there, specifically with Captain Marvel included in it, and I'm going to have to go back and read more of it. It very much tickled my fancy, to say the least.
Well, I heartily encourage
fancy.
Yes. Well, let me just hand you an extra feather with which to tickle that fancy, Ian, because and I know Pants would agree too if he were here, because he and I both love All-Star Squadron.
Yeah.
That is the first ongoing series of which I collected a complete run in back issues when I started collecting, and it was well worth the hunt, because I've got all like 60-some issues and all the annuals. It's great golden age retcon storytelling as only Roy Thomas and his various collaborators can do it, and it visits a lot of golden age favorites that might otherwise have been forgotten. The freedom fighters got new life there after their own book had been canceled back in the 70s. You're in for a real treat if you decide to pursue this, Ian.
Oh, definitely, yeah, and most of it, if not all of it, is on the DC Universe app, so it's going to be easy for me to not pay any extra money to read it.
Better still.
All right, gentlemen. For me, so similar to Ian, Captain Marvel / Shazam, and I'll borrow his term, a blind spot, especially when I was growing up. So my only exposure to the character in the 70s was the television show, which was on with ISIS, which I would watch as a very little boy. Either in the 70s or later on in the, I think it might have been in reruns even into the 80s. I have dim memories of watching that show, both of them, and I had no idea that he was even originally called Captain Marvel. All I knew was, this is Shazam, and that was the image I had of the character for quite a few years until I started to read more comics and more DC comics and start to read more about comic book history in particular, and then I started to appreciate how important this character is. And what a big deal his return was in the Bronze Age after a very fallow period.
I'm glad you brought up the Shazam TV series, Chris, because I'm pretty sure that's going to be for a lot of those listening, their first exposure to the 70s iteration of Captain Marvel as well.
Yeah.
How about you, Ian? Have you ever seen any episodes of that series featuring TV's Michael Gray?
If I have, it was very much in passing. I don't think it ever really played in in syndication here in New York. I'm trying to think if it ever really even aired on, say, like WPIX back in the day. But I do remember there being an animated version of Shazam that I watched at some point. And I don't know whether or not it was just like shorts or Hanna-Barbera-esque stuff, but I have vague recollection of that. That I remember a lot more than a live action version.
Ian, when we get to the end of this little Bronze Age mini marathon, I will be able to give you some more details about that show you remember.
Excellent.
Yeah. As for myself and the Michael Gray, Jackson Bostwick Shazam, I've seen only like a couple of snippets of a couple episodes myself. Maybe about 10 years ago or so, the TV Land Network used to run reruns as part of their late night Friday night Kitchen, KITSCHEN block. Along with some 70s Sid and Marty Krofft shows, which I was more interested in, honestly. But yeah, I quickly deduced that it didn't have very much to do with the comic book version of the character, and it kind of didn't hold my interest, I have to say. But I know it's important to a number of people as their intro to the original Captain Marvel, so I'm certainly not going to badmouth it. All right, shall we start taking a look at the opening of the Bronze Age for Captain Marvel.
My friend, by your leave.
Let us begin.
All right. All right. Well, first of all, I've headed my notes here with a section entitled "While They Were Sleeping," because as we mentioned at the end of our last Spotlight episode of Captain Shazam and the Atomic Age, 1954, at the very beginning of 1954, was the end of the Marvel family's first run in comics. That was when Fawcett settled out of court with DC, ending their decade-long court battle about the alleged similarity of Captain Marvel to Superman. And they agreed that they would stop publishing any and all comics featuring the Marvel family. They would retain the rights to the characters, they just wouldn't use them to publish comics featuring them. And so that was the end of the Marvel family in comics, and pretty soon after that, Fawcett Publishing just got out of comics altogether. So that began a period of dormancy that would turn out to last 19 years, almost to the month, from 1954 to the beginning of 1973. Now, during that time, a couple of developments happened that touch upon the Marvel family. There was a point in the mid-50s, probably almost immediately after Captain Marvel and his supporting cast were put into mothballs, when a fellow named Carmine Infantino, pretty important figure in the history of DC Comics, was shopping around a newspaper strip that he couldn't get anybody to touch because it was the mid-50s, the Atomic Age, and superheroes, with a few signal exceptions, were considered non-viable. Nobody wanted a superhero strip. But this strip that he had put together was going to be called Captain Whiz and the Colors of Evil.
Okay.
And yeah, okay is right. That's probably what a lot of the people he pitched this thing to said too. But apparently, I don't know much about the Captain Whiz pitch. Even Infantino himself was a little fuzzy on the details. This was not a period of his personal career history that he brought up very much until 2004, when he decided to make it a legal issue. But apparently, this character was kind of loosely inspired by the original Captain Marvel, and probably the Colors of Evil would have been loosely inspired by the Seven Deadly Enemies of Man. But he couldn't get anybody to bite on it, so eventually he was talking to Julie Schwartz, and Julie, who was a legendary editor at DC Comics, and he tapped Infantino, who had done a couple of Golden Age Flash stories, to do the Silver Age revival of the Flash with a Barry Allen character. And Infantino kind of used a very similar visual design to what he had for this Captain Whiz character of his for the Barry Allen costume. So there you are. This Captain Whiz is kind of like the missing link between the Golden Age Captain Marvel and the Silver Age Flash. Thanks to Infantino. So in a way, Captain Marvel's DNA did surface as a very important part of the early Silver Age of comics, even though the good Captain himself never made an appearance during the Silver Age. Or did he?
They really pissed away an opportunity by not publishing Captain Whiz.
Pissed away.
Oh my God, Ian.
It took me a few too many seconds to understand what you were doing there, Ian.
Ian's so intoxicated that he's now on a Spotlight episode. He's letting it all rush to his head.
Oh, yes.
We got an outburst like that.
You deserve a better audience than we, Ian. Almost as much as you deserve better writers.
Yes. Both are true.
Yeah. Oh, and one more little note about Captain Whiz. I mentioned 2004. That was the year that Infantino sued DC for ownership and creator royalties for Barry Allen and a lot of his supporting cast in Rogues Gallery, because he claimed that's what he brought up the Captain Whiz and the Colors of Evil thing, because he said Barry Allen was just a modified version of his Captain Whiz, and the Colors of Evil were then modified into the Rogues Gallery. Like, he claimed the purple guy from the Colors of Evil became Gorilla Grodd.
I'm guessing he didn't win that one.
He did not. Actually, it was the suit was dismissed within a year.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's Captain Whiz for you. That's a little. So we nearly got something like a Captain Marvel character about 15 years before we actually did. And then, now when Fawcett shut down publication, when they stopped publishing comics, most of their staff were let go. Some of them got work elsewhere in the Fawcett magazine empire. But the comics professionals were pretty much out in the cold. Some of them ended up ironically working for DC. One of them was an artist named Kurt Schaffenberger. And I call out now to Eric Nolan Wethington to let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Often that particle Schaffen is anglicized to Schaefer or Schaffen in English, but since Mr. Schaffenberger is a first-generation German immigrant. He probably might have retained something closer to the original German pronunciation. So I'm going to go with Schaffenberger for the rest of this episode. So, Eric, please let me know if I'm right to do that.
But Murd, even if you're wrong, that was such an authoritative explanation of why you're going with Schaffenberger that works for me.
Well, I'm living in a heavily German part of the country here, Chris, so it's kind of incumbent on me to get stuff like this right.
As a Levenstein who has many a time been a Levenstein or a Levinstein, I completely relate with Mr. Schaffenberger.
Well, and I for all our sakes, I hope I'm doing him justice.
Same here.
He's no longer with us, so he can't complain personally. But
yeah.
Anyway, he is one of the Fawcett staffers that found his way to DC, and he was the regular penciler on the Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane comic for a while. And on a particular issue, number 42, cover dated July 1963, Captain Marvel got a tiny little background cameo in a couple of panels of that story. Lois, in that issue, had acquired some kind of magic wishing power, and she was fantasizing about how that power might benefit her in her life. And she's kind of fantasizing about Superman beating up all these other super people who were coming from galaxies around to court Lois Lane. And he's beating them all up and telling them, go back to your planets. Lois is mine. And one of them is kind of obviously the big red cheese.
Does it actually show the costume?
Well, it doesn't show the lightning bolt logo. It's kind of him from the back. But
Gotcha.
It's the red suit, the yellow boots, the white cape.
Gotcha.
And it's Schaffenberger, who was one of the eminent Captain Marvel artists of the Golden Age, drawing it.
Yeah.
So put it all together, and that's actually acknowledged as a Captain Marvel appearance in a lot of databases.
I'm reminded of that unofficial crossover between the Justice League and the Avengers that happened, where they essentially just created analogs and
the Squadron Supreme.
Yes, well, not even that. Wasn't there an issue or two where they created entirely separate analogs for Justice League and Avengers, and they showed up like almost month by month in DC and Marvel. I'll have to look that up, but vague recollection of that outside of the Squadron Supreme. Yeah. Yeah,
and then DC had versions of Marvel characters, including Blue Jay and Silver Sorceress and Wandjina and so forth.
Definitely, yes.
Who have made a bunch of appearances over the years, too. Yep, so just more friendly badinage across publisher lines there.
All right, so after we were done recording, I went and looked up what the hell I was talking about, and it turns out what I was thinking of was in 1972, Steve Englehart, Jerry Conway, and Len Wein put together a loose crossover between the Justice League and the Avengers. It began in Amazing Adventures number 16, where the Beast hitches a ride from Englehart, who's driving the Weins and Jerry Conway to Rutland. And Juggernaut attempts to steal Steve Englehart's car at this point. And then we pick up in Justice League number 103, with Batman and other Justice Leaguers winding up at the parade while attempting to capture Felix Faust. And Faust ultimately steals Englehart's car and is pulled over by police. And then in the third unofficial crossover, Thor number 207, the three comics creators again visit Fagin, during which Englehart's car is stolen by the unseen and unmentioned DC villain Felix Faust, as shown in JLA number 103. Plus, you have an appearance of a Commander America, and that takes place in the Justice League issue, and there's also a mention of a web slinger in that. So that is the crossover I was trying to piece together while we were having this conversation. We now return to our conversation already in progress.
All right, Murd, educate us on Milson Publishing, please.
Oh, it will be my pleasure.
Yeah,
because this was something close to a Fawcett revival. It was a startup publishing venture that was put together by some former Fawcett people, and specifically former Fawcett executive editor Will Lieberson and former Fawcett writer Bernie Miller. Those two men, together with one brother of theirs each, Bernie Miller's brother Joe and Will Lieberson's brother Martin, they all pooled their resources to form a company that they decided to call Milson Publishing. Miller, Lieberson, just kind of portmanteau them together, and you get Milson. So they formed that company in 1967 to try to catch lightning in a bottle a second time, if you will. and recapture some of the old Fawcett magic. So they dug into their Rolodexes and contacted some of the old Fawcett creators, including C.C. Beck, co-creator and by anyone's measure, the definitive premier artist of the original Captain Marvel, and also Otto Binder, who wrote famously between 54 and 57% of the total Marvel family content produced at Fawcett back in the 40s and 50s. So they got the old gang back together, basically, at Milson Publishing, and they were going to put out comics under the imprint Lightning Comics. Their corner box company logo was a little thundercloud with a lightning bolt coming down from it. It was basically like the classic Captain Marvel boom panel drawn by C.C. Beck. That was their logo. And, of course, they couldn't do Captain Marvel stories, but they created a new character that they hoped would be the vehicle for good, clean, fun, whimsical storytelling, the likes of which Fawcett was famous for back in the old days. And the character they came up with for this was called Fat Man the Human Flying Saucer.
It's terribly unfortunate.
Yeah, they could get away with that in 1967. So, yes, he was billed as the superhero with 3 secret identities. His baseline alter ego was wealthy, good-hearted, but lazy, wealthy idler Van Crawford. He was basically Bruce Wayne if his parents had never died and if he had developed an eating disorder. He spent all his time pursuing hobbies like stamp collecting and bird watching and stuff. His parents were kind of disappointed in him. But then one day, while on a bird watching trip, he rescued a small flying saucer that appeared to be in distress. And it turns out that it wasn't really in distress. It was just pretending to be as like a test of the moral fiber of whatever human beings it encountered. And Van Crawford was apparently the first one that offered to help it. So as a thanks, it offers him a magic chocolate malted that when he consumes it gives him superpowers. And so he gets like enhanced speed and strength, just like the usual package. And he also gets a costume that looks very much like Captain Marvel's costume, with the short cape. The only difference is that it's a green and yellow costume instead of a red and yellow one, and he's got kind of an image of a flying saucer on his chest. And foremost among his superpowers, whenever he exerts himself a little bit, builds up a bit of a sweat, just runs a certain distance, he gains the ability to transform his entire body into a human flying saucer. And that's his 3rd secret identity. He's Van Crawford, he's Fat Man, and he is a human flying saucer.
Wait, Murd, a question. So the saucer that gives this power, is this a spaceship or an anthropomorphic entity?
Both. Okay. I think it's like a space alien that happens to assume the form of a flying saucer.
Gotcha.
And that would be how it gives Van Crawford the ability to do the same thing.
And you're saying he got part of his powers from a chocolate malt?
Yeah, there's some kind of alien chemical potion that happens to taste like chocolate.
Okay, we have to I'm going to take a wild guess as to why this failed. We have to remember the time period. So this is like the height of the Marvel Age, for example, in the Silver Age.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had stories like the Galactus saga.
Galactus,
right? We've Spider-Man, Wakanda, Thor, Avengers. So this Murd, tell me if I'm out of line here. This sounds like they were trying to capture lightning in a bottle that had long since expired.
Well, I don't think they were ever really trying to compete with Marvel here, Chris. They were going after a different audience. I mean, this was also the camp age of comics, you might call it.
That's true. Well, good point.
And let me also add that from your description of his costume with the green and the flying saucer, it sounds a lot like the Marvel Captain Marvel's original costume.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I can see that. Except it's the color of the main costume and the trim are kind of reversed there. Like the original Marvel costume was mostly white with green.
It was a cream military uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's true that that sort of ringed planet he has as his chest insignia is pretty similar to the flying saucer that Van Crawford had. So yeah, I can see that, Ian. Good point.
How long did this run for, Murd?
It ran for, I believe, 3 issues.
Okay.
Yeah, and issue number 4 was well underway when Milson had to fold its tent. So it is the Marvel Age of comics, Chris. You're right, but they weren't trying to do the same kind of comics Marvel was doing. They were courting more like the Archie crowd.
Gotcha.
So it was not a character meant to be taken seriously. I mean, his major weakness was food.
Oh God.
Not only that, his catchphrases were all food-related also. Instead of saying things like holy moly or great Scott, he said things like galloping goulash and hopping hamburgers and great Caesar salad. So, yeah, a little goofy. And who knows, there might actually have been an audience for something like this. There were a couple of old Golden Age masters working on it. And those back issues are actually sought by certain collectors.
Oh, I believe it.
All three of them.
Especially if he's shouting about goulash. Come on.
Yeah, but I think the real problem with the Milson titles, well, at least in Fat Man's case, maybe even more so than the content, was just the issue was distribution. They really didn't have a good distribution network in place. They didn't have the contacts at the news dealer syndicates. They just couldn't get their comics to newsstands. So they published these things, and a lot of people didn't even have the opportunity to buy them. So the company ended up folding. It published two series, Fat Man and something else called Todd Holton Super Green Beret, which Otto Binder also worked on. And they were working on a third title also. They actually went so far as to produce a house ad for it, which ran in, I guess, the third issue of Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer. It was advertising Captain Shazam.
Wait a minute. Oh, that's on the nose. Yeah. I don't know what Captain Shazam was going to be. Otto Binder, in a later reminiscence, claimed that they had, quote, the costume and gimmicks all written out. So they knew at least what Captain Shazam was going to be, but I'm afraid the rest of us never will. I think the nature of the character has been lost to history. But the house ad described Captain Shazam as, quote, a turned-on super swinger. Cool. Tough, fab. And it was going to be brought to you by the Now Comics Group. Apparently Lightning Comics wasn't with it enough, so they had to come up with a different trade name. Apparently this publisher, like Fat Man, had 3 secret identities. But we never got to see Captain Shazam.
Ah, you're mining some gems, sir. I do none of this stuff. This is fantastic.
Yes. It's some fun stuff, and I should probably to attribute sources here. Another fine Tomorrow's publication by Michael Urey, I believe it was, Hero a Go-Go.
Great book.
The camp age of comics. It's that term actually comes from him too. But he did do a 2-page feature just on Milson and Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer.
Now, Murd, a question: did you say there are no surviving sketch work of the Captain Shazam concept? We don't have anything like that?
None that anyone's been able to find. At least I don't think so. I mean, and again, Eric Nolan Wethington might know better than I. There has been an issue of Alter Ego magazine focusing on Otto Binder as a creator. So maybe there's something about Captain Shazam in there.
I have to read it again.
I found a cover of Flying Saucer number 3 on a Newsarama article, and I'm amazed at not only it's issue 3. Not only does it have a character that looks exactly like Robot Man from the Doom Patrol on the cover, only giant. But it also has a very similar design to the Alpha Flight character.
Oh wow! I'm looking at these covers. This is amazing.
Yeah, and dear God, it's just so ridiculously campy in every single way.
Wait a minute. Fat Man, a sensational new fighting hero of pachyderm proportions, whose adventures are, in bold, overweighted with thrills he strikes like a ton of bricks. Crooks have slim chances as he tips the scales, in bold, against crime at every turn. But that's not all. Fat Man's exploits reach soaring heights in high-speed action, full of horsepower punch with the sky the limit.
Man.
Did I mention he has a sidekick named Tin Man?
Wow.
Yes, he's Tin Man. It's kind of like Thin Man.
Wait, Murd, I'm sorry. Wait, I have to read this. Wait. He's Van Crawford, gentle fancier of rare tropical exotics.
And a Pisces.
This is tremendous. Oh, look at this. Anybody, you can go to Google, you type in Fat Man Flying Saucer, comes up immediately. There's a wealth of stuff here.
Beautiful.
And there's even a Fred Hembeck sketch. Wow.
Yes, this is the kind of thing Fred Hembeck adores.
I see what you're saying, though, how they clearly riffed right on the Captain Marvel outfit, though. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I see the ad for Captain Shazam as well when I search for for Mission, Milson publishing Captain Shazam. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't say anything other than that it's coming soon. No actual sketch of the character.
Now, Murd, let me ask you, because I've always been wondered about this. You note here that, as you said, Milson ran out of money, but there was also apparently friction between the other creators and C.C. Beck. Now, does C.C. Beck have a reputation for being difficult?
He absolutely did, yes.
Okay. So I don't know much about him. So,
yeah, we'll learn a little bit more about that when we talk about his brief time doing artwork for DC.
Okay.
But yeah, he, as you just said, Chris, Milson, thanks to their distribution woes, they didn't sell very many comics, and they ran out of their startup capital. They took a bath to the tune of multiple thousands of dollars, of $64,000, and that was in 1967.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. So, but yeah, also complicating things was that C.C. Beck was as abrasive as ever, and actually proved difficult for him to even work with Otto Binder, a man with whom he collaborated to quite some extent back in the old days, and not a difficult person to get along with by all accounts. So Lieberson and Miller had to kind of scramble a little bit, and they brought in a couple of very old-school Fawcett editors, Rod Reed, who had been both a writer and an editor for Fawcett at different times, and Wendell Crowley, who was thought of by some as the definitive Captain Marvel editor of the late Golden Age, who had retired from comics and had been working at his family's lumber company in New Jersey and not enjoying it very much. So at least for a couple brief months, those guys, especially Crowley, got a chance to work in comics again to try and hold the ship together after Binder and Beck started to have creative differences. But it all became moot when the money ran out and everybody had to once again go their separate ways. But interesting little Silver Age footnote there for the old
great footnote, Murd.
Captain Marvel.
Great.
Game. And, of course, let's not forget a couple of other Silver Age characters who happened to bear the name Captain Marvel, one of whom will be very well known to our listeners. There's actually an entire Spotlight episode already devoted to him, among a couple of other cosmic characters.
Indeed.
And so that, of course, would be Marvel. He was introduced in, was it Marvel Superheroes number 12 or 13?
I want to say 12.
Okay, it was December 1967. I think I have that much right anyway. And so there's much that has been said about him elsewhere. But anyway, he was there, and he's the main reason why we're going to be talking about comic books called Shazam as opposed to comics called Captain Marvel coming out from DC. And then there's that other Captain Marvel, whom Chris lovingly and gleefully referenced a few minutes ago, and I love you for it, Chris. This is the Captain Marvel character that was produced by a fly-by-night entity called MF Enterprises, MF standing for publisher Myron Fass. And this is a character that just kind of glommed onto the name of Captain Marvel for that brief time when the trademark on it had run out and before Marvel had really solidly gotten their claws into it. And they introduced their own Captain Marvel character who had nothing to do with any version of Captain Marvel before or since. This MF Enterprises version of Captain Marvel first appeared in 1966. He had 6 comic book appearances before MF disappeared into limbo. And he was an alien android who came to Earth, posed as a college professor or something, and his main superpower was he could cause his limbs to shoot off of his robot body and fly around through the air under their own power, directed by his mind, I guess, to punch and kick bad guys remotely. And
Split!
Yes. There's that magic word. That was the trigger to make his limbs go rocketing off. And do you happen to know what the other magic word he said to make them return to his body, Chris?
I don't, actually.
Zam. X-A-M. Which combined with split Zam, it's you can kind of hear the echo of the word Shazam in there.
Doesn't have the drama, of Flame On or Avengers Assemble, but I'm digging it.
It's just fun to yell things.
Yeah.
One of the worst superpowers I have ever heard of.
Because you have to wonder, what does his defenseless torso do?
Yeah.
And all
Bounce,
his limbs
I
are
guess.
flying about.
I think there might be some kind of force field. I mean, I seem to recall he had an amulet he wore that might have protected his body and his trunk while the rest of his limbs are doing their thing. And, he actually had a kid sidekick named Billy Baxton.
Really? I didn't know that. Okay.
So, oh, what a giveaway.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, so, like I said, 6 issues of that. There was no consistency of any kind. I mean, it was the creators varied very much from issue to issue. His supporting cast was never the same from one issue to the next. Sometimes he was a college professor. Sometimes he was doing something else. They were just putting out the books and trying to make money. And he ended up fighting mostly bad guys that were nominal knockoffs of like that stole the names of other existing characters too, like Plastic Man and Dr. Fate.
And funny enough, all of their limbs fell apart too.
What are the odds? Yeah, so that was kind of a blotch on the escutcheon of Captain Marvel. Not the best character to bear that name.
God, I love the word escutcheon. Oh, fantastic, Murd.
Yes, it's...
And Ian, I think in a previous life, you were like the guy who warmed up the crowd at vaudeville shows.
Well, I am Jewish, and I know that
you and the Borscht Belt. My God.
I know my dad used to take vacations to the Borscht Belt with his family when he was younger, and one of my favorite shows is The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So clearly, it shows.
Indeed. All right. All right, Murd, I'm very excited for your next section here because, again, there's stuff here, especially about Kirby, that I did not know about. So please proceed.
All right. So now, after covering what was going on with the Marvels while they didn't exist in the Silver Age, we finally get to the beginning of their Bronze Age. And so their stirrings of life began in 1972. And we have Carmine Infantino to thank for that. And he was, again, the guy who nearly gave Captain Marvel a kind of unofficial revival with Captain Whiz in the mid-'50s. He was clearly a fan of the Captain Marvel character and his supporting cast. And in 72, by then, he had become the publisher of national periodical publications, alternately known as DC, though that wouldn't become their official name for 4 more years. But anyway, he... once he assumed this position of power, he decided that DC needed to pursue a few more licensed properties. And he definitely wanted Captain Marvel to be among those. So he aggressively pursued and ultimately acquired the rights to Captain Marvel and Friends from Fawcett Publications, whom, as we said, had been out of comics publishing for years by then, on behalf of DC, which is something of an ironic development. DC basically hounds Captain Marvel and Friends out of publication, although that's kind of an oversimplification of things. Fawcett just decided comics weren't profitable anymore and made the decision on their own, although DC certainly helped make it easier.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you have to know that lawsuit went on for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
And they continued to publish Captain Marvel and other Fawcett heroes throughout. So,
but the upshot there is that DC came back and ended up buying all of Fawcett's old superhero characters from them. It took a little longer for them to negotiate the non-Captain Marvel characters, the Fawcett's other superheroes like Bullet Man, although they would eventually become part of the DC stable. But it was a while before we would actually see them in DC Comics. At first, it was just Captain Marvel, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, and their immediate supporting cast and friends and foes. And once Infantino had acquired these characters, the question then became what would be done with them and who would be doing it. Now, this is what most intrigued Chris, as he alluded to a moment ago. One of the early bids to take the reins of the Marvel family of characters was a recent arrival to DC in the early 70s, none other than Jack King Kirby.
Wow.
He was interested in doing some stuff with the Marvel family. He offered to be the editor of the upcoming ongoing featuring these characters, and he was going to hire on C.C. Beck himself to be the artist, and Kirby's friend Mark Evanier as writer.
Who would have been a perfect writer for that series.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, he would have known how to get that tone just right, just based on the stuff he had already written at that time for, like, Del Gold Key. He knew how to do licensed properties.
And what's interesting, if you go back to our Golden Age spotlights on Shazam and also the Kirby spotlights we did a couple of years ago, one of the first and highest selling Golden Age Shazam stories, or Captain Marvel stories, I should say, was done by the Simon and Kirby studio. Was it Captain Marvel Adventures #1, Murd?
It was.
Yeah. So there is some history there with Kirby and Captain Marvel.
Yes, thank you for. Yeah, I would have forgotten to recite that piece of information, Chris. Thank you very much.
I live to serve, my friend. But I'm the thought of Kirby, because remember, this is when he comes over. He's had it with Marvel. He comes to DC, flushed with new ideas. The Fourth World, of course, will come out of that, and so forth. And the thought of him, taking the helm on Shazam is fascinating. I bet he would have done some covers too, and what a missed opportunity.
And could have seen Captain Marvel fighting Darkseid as early as 1973.
Oh boy. Wow. And to even think about it, considering the problems that Kirby and the Kirby estate had to try to get Kirby the rights that he deserved for the stuff that he did for Marvel Comics. For him to be, so involved in, Captain Marvel of all things coming to DC and trying to get his feet involved with that, and to also get some of the original creators involved is a really extra wrinkle that I kind of appreciate. With this whole process here, rights are such a very interesting and unique thing, and it's still weird to me to this day that DC essentially stopped them from publishing the damn character, and he wound up with DC after all those years later. It's such a fascinating wrinkle in the history of comic books.
And the last vestige of that era is that, like, when you saw the recent Shazam movie, wasn't the high school called Fawcett High School?
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So
a little concession to history there, since they decided to set it in a real city as opposed to Fawcett City.
Yep.
Although, there's kind of a little interesting, another interesting wrinkle, to use Ian's term there, historically around the name Fawcett City, which I'll say for the very end of our run here. Because it wasn't until the very end of the pre-crisis era for Captain Marvel that he was established as operating in Fawcett City. I hadn't even known that until I started doing research for this spotlight.
Wow.
All right, so anyway, with a missed opportunity indeed, DC passed on Kirby's offer, mainly because Kirby at that time was on the West Coast, and DC wanted to keep all this stuff they wanted to keep this project and as many other projects as possible in-house. So they didn't want to farm it out to the West Coast and let Kirby do his thing with it out there. So instead, the legendary Julie Schwartz was ordained as the editor of this new Captain Marvel project. In fact, he's the one who is credited with coming up with the idea of entitling it Shazam, because, of course, Marvel wasn't going to let them call this Captain Marvel, because Marvel's own Captain Marvel character was already being published. They kind of had the squatters' rights to the trademark. So it was Julie Schwartz who came up with the idea of calling it Shazam, as opposed to something like The World's Mightiest Mortal or some alternate name. So he became the editor, and the original announced creative team, which had fandom, especially those old enough to remember the original Captain Marvel adventures, the creative team was announced as Denny O'Neil as writer and Bob Oxner as penciler. And Oxner was not especially comfortable with this arrangement, since, by his own admission, he had never even heard of Captain Marvel until he was offered the chance to pencil this series. But then C.C. Beck became available. Now, I think the way it worked out, recollections do vary. That's often the way it goes with the history of comics, since we often have to rely on oral history for these things, as to whether DC reached out to Beck or Beck reached out to DC. But I think what happened was that Beck contacted DC and offered to once again draw his own character. And DC responded by asking him to send in an art sample. This is the guy who created the character.
Oh, boy.
And DC wants him to prove graphically his worthiness to continue to do so in the 1970s. So Beck kind of shrugged and drew an image of Captain Marvel as Rip Van Winkle, playing on the fact that he'd basically been asleep for 19 years and was just now going to wake up. And that was all anybody at DC needed, fortunately. And so Beck was on board, and he was announced as the penciler, or the artist for this new run of Captain Marvel adventures in the 70s, with Denny O'Neil as writer. And Bob Oxner was kind of relieved about that, but Oxner would still get his chance to draw some Captain Marvel stories later on in the 70s, as we'll see. So the creative team was in place, Schwartz as editor, O'Neil as writer, and Beck, the original co-creator of the Captain, as the artist. And that brings us up to the debut at DC Comics of Captain Marvel, the World's Mightiest Mortal, in Shazam #1, February 1973 was the cover date. It actually hit stands in late 1972. And it's just about exactly 19 years, give or take a month either way, of when they went into dormancy in 1954. We can start with the cover. I'm going to spend a little more time on this issue than I will a lot of the subsequent stories. And so we're going to try to kick it into high gear speed-wise as we go here, because we don't want to be here all night. But the first issue is pretty important historically. So the cover, further ironies here. We have Billy Batson changing into Captain Marvel. The art there is by C.C. Beck. He signs it. And but off to the left-hand side, This is a fairly famous cover image. We have Superman standing there, drawn by Nick Carty, with the facial features retouched by Murphy Anderson. He is pulling back a curtain and gesturing towards Captain Marvel, as though introducing him to readers. And indeed, he probably was, since a lot of people buying comics in 1972 or 3 probably weren't old enough to remember the first run of Captain Marvel stories. So there's this DC icon introducing us to this character that DC helped to put out of business back in 1954, and now he's introducing him back into comics. All in good fun. And then there's that famous cover logo, Shazam, with the exclamation bolt at the end. Over that are the words, first brand new issue with one magic word, Shazam, and below it, the original Captain Marvel. So DC does get to boast a little bit about how this is another Captain Marvel character on the cover, although Marvel eventually did send them a cease and desist about that even. And so those words, the original Captain Marvel, only appear on the cover of the first 14 issues of the series. With issue
we should note, I'm sorry, Murray, go ahead, I apologize.
With issue 15, the original Captain Marvel was replaced with the phrase, the world's mightiest mortal.
And we should note that they could still call him Captain Marvel within the stories, correct, at this point?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, it's the same thing with there being multiple scarecrows in DC and Marvel and what have you. It's very hard to stop people from using a name in a story itself, as opposed to on the cover where it's most prominent. I feel like that's a bit more of a stickler scenario.
And Murd, you note that, like with many of the issues in the series, they were putting in classic Golden Age reprints.
Yes, absolutely. That's for the first several issues of the series. Each issue of Shazam consisted of 2 lead stories, just maybe 10 or so pages each, and a Golden Age reprint in the back. So that is true of this first issue as well. We've got a story reprinted from Captain Marvel Adventures number 55 in the back of this comic.
And Suspendium.
Yes, Suspendium, yes. Okay, so opening the comic, we get a great splash page by Beck, of course. Captain Marvel flying triumphantly out at the reader, and one of the biggest boom panels ever to appear in a Captain Marvel comic to that point, taking up the whole page pretty much. The lightning bolt coming down in the background as Captain Marvel flies in the foreground, and the title, In the Beginning. And as we turn the page, the first thing we see is just Billy Batson walking down the street as if nothing had happened since 1954, and waving to a passerby and saying, "Hello there, Mr. Binder." And Mr. Binder is carrying a portfolio with the initials OOB on it, so it's pretty obvious whom this is supposed to be. Class?
Mr. Otto Binder.
Exactly.
Nice.
Yes, making a cameo, and appropriately so, because, as we've said, he did more than any other single writer to build the Captain Marvel mythos of the Golden Age, and he was not destined to write any actual Captain Marvel stories in the Bronze Age, so it's nice that they gave him this little cameo.
Yeah.
Which is actually, they didn't even tell him they were going to do it, as it turns out.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to flip quick here to the letters column in Shazam number 4. They did send a complimentary copy of Shazam number 1 to Otto Binder and to a couple other Golden Age creators from Fawcett's past. And here's the letter that he sent in response. Thanks for the inscribed copy of Shazam and your compliment. I was quite startled when I first heard, from a fan, that my name was actually used in the first script, evidently as a tribute from the writer. So there was a surprise for him. The comics seem like some long-ago dream, and I have no slightest hankering to go back to them. In case you're wondering, I see that C.C. Beck has the same old magic touch he used to have with the big red cheese. Your writer seems to be good, capturing the flavor nicely. So there's Otto Binder granting his blessing to this enterprise, even though he had no desire whatsoever to be a part of it. Not that I think DC seriously made him the offer, but he would have turned it down if they had. One thing should be noted about Mr. Binder is... in the spring of 1967, right around the time when Millicent Publishing got started and then fell apart, Otto Binder's only child, his teenage daughter
horrible.
Mary, died in an auto accident.
Oh, no.
And all the magic of comics seemed to dissipate for him after that. So he just kind of retired and just withdrew from the world of comics altogether.
That's a shame.
And as fate would have it, he would actually pass away himself in October of 1974, not long after the events we're now describing. So, such is Otto Binder's exit from the world of Captain Marvel. But at least he got that little cameo there. So Otto Binder gets to be the person who passes Billy Batson on the street. And he does a double take when he realizes, hey, Billy Batson, but you've been missing for 20 years. And you haven't aged. You're still a kid. How come? And Billy says, it's a long story, Mr. Binder. You just wouldn't believe it. And then Mr. Binder wanders off in distress, and Billy just kind of chuckles and thinks to himself, oh boy, a lot of unbelievable things have happened to me. And then he launches into a 6-page reminiscence, which is basically a recap of his Golden Age origin. All the classic elements are there, the enchanted subway car, the visit with old Shazam, the bestowal of his powers, and then Shazam dying under a giant block of granite. It's all retold there in classic form. And then we move from there right on back to the present of 1973, as Billy is thinking to himself, that was the beginning. For the next few years, I made good my promise. I mean, Captain Marvel's promise. I fought evildoers everywhere, and I usually won. Then the world's wickedest scientist found a way to exile me. Well, exile's over, and I'm going after the man who caused it. And that leads us right into the main story of this issue, which is entitled The World's Wickedest Plan. It's again by Denny O'Neil and C.C. Beck, and it's here where we learn just what has happened in story to the Marvel family and their friends and foes during the past 19 years. The creative team decided to address that semi-metatextually here, instead of just saying, okay, the past 19 years haven't really happened, and the Marvel family's been active continually for however many years that is comic book time. Instead, 19 years real time have passed, and the Marvels find themselves in a world they never made, having to adjust to the early 1970s. And the story goes on to tell us, it begins with Captain Marvel capturing a couple of crooks named Julie and Charlie, as in Schwartz and C.C. Beck. The first C stands for Charles. So a little meta cameo there by the editor and artist. And he captures them, and he's convinced that they're working for Sivana. And they're his first lead to capturing Sivana. And then he launches into another flashback sequence, which explains where everybody's been for 19 years. Apparently, back in 1954, Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary are all accepting like a public award, and all their friends were present for this, when suddenly a kind of tractor beam sucks them all up into space. And up in a spaceship up above, abducting all these people, are Dr. Sivana, Captain Marvel's archenemy, and his nefarious children, Georgia Sivana and Thaddeus Jr. And they're abducting the Marvel family and all their friends, everybody who happens to be standing around them, and sealing them in a globe made out of a wonder metal of Sivana's own design, Suspendium, which is perfectly in line with the Golden Age style. Sivana or Captain Marvel were always coming up with some miracle alloy or other with a silly-sounding name like that. As it turns out, Suspendium has the property of placing any living being within it into a state of suspended animation. So Sivana's intent is to just imprison Captain Marvel and the Marvel family forever in this globe as it eternally orbits the Earth. However, Thad Jr. Gets a little over-boisterous in congratulating his papa on a successful scheme, and he smacks Sivana on the back and knocks Sivana into the controls. Their spaceship goes out of control and crashes into the Suspendium globe, knocking it slightly off course and also making the Sivanas subject to the Suspendium's effects. So now the Sivana family and the Marvel family and their whole supporting cast are trapped in this Suspendium globe for 19 years as its orbit becomes more erratic, and it spins closer and closer to the sun, until finally, at the end of 1972, the Suspendium starts to dissipate. And Captain Marvel, of course, being the mightiest of them all, he first awakens from the waning effects of the Suspendium, and he immediately goes into action. He frees Mary and Junior. The three of them push the Suspendium globe back down to Earth while the Sivanas get away temporarily. They smash the globe open and free everybody inside. And on page 8, we're treated to a little one-panel view of all the, well, not all the people who were trapped in there with him, as it turns out. They keep as the series wears on throughout the 70s and into the 80s, it's revealed that more and more people that the writers wanted to use that had been part of the Captain Marvel's orbit back in the 40s and 50s, but apparently didn't age at all in the intervening time. They were all in the Suspendium globe also. But the little crowd that we get to see in this panel, and E. Nelson Bridwell has a text page later in the issue that provides a little graphic key, a little who's who to who all these characters are. They are, first of all, Uncle Marvel, the honorary member of the Marvel family who has no powers whatsoever but pretends to, and he's such a lovable old fraud that the other Marvels just go along with it. There's Billy's receptionist, Miss Joan Jameson, who is one of the people who knows that Billy and Captain Marvel are one and the same, although it was kind of a point of honor with the old Fawcett creators, and this was continued by the DC creators of the 70s, that Billy's secret identity was not a big deal. Like there was not endless stories as with Superman where he was taking ridiculous great pains to keep his secret identity a secret. Billy would just say Shazam out on a crowded street and a lightning bolt would strike him and everybody would be like, huh? And nobody ever put two and two together. I've always just kind of assumed it was a magic side effect of the magic lightning.
Like Peter Parker in the MCU.
Did you say Peter Porker or Peter Parker?
Peter Parker, yeah. No, like Peter Parker in basically every single MCU movie so far, how he can't keep his damn mask on, and everybody probably knows who he is by now.
I'm Peter Parker. Yeah, he does. He should just have cards printed eventually. But anyway, Joan Jameson is one of the few people who actually knows his secret and cares about it and keeps it for him. And, of course, Mr. Sterling Morris, who is Billy's boss, the owner of Whiz Radio and Television. Mr. Morris's niece, Sissy Summerlee, who is Billy's girlfriend. Ma and Pa Potter, the kindly old couple in whose boarding house Billy lives. Professor Edgewise, one of a large number of lovable crackpot scientists that populated the pages of Golden Age Captain Marvel stories. Dr. Savannah's good daughter, Beautia Savannah, who, along with her brother Magnificus, they're like the white sheep of the family. Savannah's got two kids who are tall and blonde and attractive and good of heart, and then there's the two kids that take after him. So Beautia is one of those that kind of is a shame to Savannah, and she was in the Suspendium Globe with all the others. And, of course, Mr. Talkie Tawny, the talking.
Of course.
Yeah, you can't do a Marvel revival without him in some form.
So, Murd, it sounds like from your description, because I have not read this issue, that they really try to infuse that Golden Age flavor into this story.
Without a question. Yeah, Ian's observation near the beginning of this episode is really on target. I mean, it's they tried very hard, especially at the beginning, to preserve that Golden Age flavor.
Yeah.
And even when we got to the World's Finest run in the latter 70s, thanks to Bridwell, who was a huge fan of the old material and had an encyclopedic knowledge of it, he did his best to preserve as much of the old history and the old tone as he could, while also making it slightly more sophisticated for the late 70s discerning comics buyer. But yeah, it never quite lost that luster of the Golden Age.
And nor should it.
Yes, although it kind of depends on whom you ask. You know, there are some, as Matt might call them, Fawcett hardos who just convince themselves that nothing DC ever did with these characters could ever possibly match the magic of the Golden Age.
Now, you note here, as we finish out this look at the first issue, that there's a lot of hostility between C.C. Beck and Julie Schwartz.
Yeah, Schwartz pretty much despised Beck from day one. And there's kind of an apocryphal account, you know, that a legend, if you will, that Beck, that Schwartz asked C.C. Beck to redraw the cover image from issue number 1, and that he later gloated that he claimed that the cover had gotten lost, but he supposedly later gloated to friends and associates that it was never lost. He had it. He just wanted to make Beck draw something else because he disliked the man so much. And Beck was, by most accounts, a difficult person to work with. I mean, he is one of those accounts, actually. He referred to himself, he had a column once called the Crusty Curmudgeon, a play on his initials. So he was aware of how opinionated and difficult he was.
I guess there's something to be said for that type of self-awareness.
Yeah, it does mitigate the negative effects it can have on one's coworkers sometimes.
I also want to point out one of the reasons why I wasn't able to check out these issues, and something that DC is going to have to fix sooner than later, although I know they're still adding and digitizing a whole bunch of books, minute by minute as much as possible. This entire series is unavailable digitally at this point.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It is not on Comixology, and it is not on the DC Universe app. So get on that, DC, because I'd love to read some of these old issues eventually. But
well, considering the hullabaloo about the movie, that surprises me.
Yeah, I know. The very first thing that you see with the name Shazam on it is the 80s series, and it doesn't happen until then. So that's
Wow.
very surprising, to say the least.
So that's the 4-issue Roy Thomas miniseries?
Correct.
That's the first thing.
Yep. Yeah, that is the first thing that's listed from the looks of it in Comixology as well, unless my eyes deceive me.
Yeah, that is baffling to me.
Yep.
Well, one alternative I could recommend, if you can track down a copy maybe on Amazon or someplace, DC did produce one showcase reprint volume of this 70s Shazam material. It's a Showcase Presents Shazam Volume 1, 500 pages of comics for $16.99. It's in black and white, which is suboptimal, but at least it's something. And I bought my copy at Wild Pig Comics several years ago.
Nice.
It's actually been very helpful to me if I need like a quick ready reference with a table of contents to look up what month a certain issue was published or who the creative team was. I have it right here at my side as we're talking about this. But not everything from this 70s run of Shazam is reprinted in that volume, it should be said. None of the reprint stories are, the Golden Age stuff is reprinted in this volume, just the stuff that was new in the early 70s. And not even all of that, because there's one story, as we'll see eventually, that features the character Isis from the live-action TV show that DC could not reprint because they no longer had the license.
Right. Makes sense.
All right. And one more note about Shazam number 1. Captain Marvel rounds up the Savannas in the end and hauls them away to prison. But the Savannas pause in mid-scowl to agree with Captain Marvel that it's great to be alive after 19 years of non-publication. So there we are. The Shazam series of the 70s is off and running. Right now, let's move on to issue number 2, which finds the return of another classic Captain Marvel foe of the Golden Age, Mr. Mind, who had not actually been seen in comics since the Golden Age, since at the end of the classic Monster Society of Evil serial, he was shown to have been electrocuted. Sentenced to death in the electric chair after causing the death of 186,744 people. So he earned the title World's Wickedest Worm by doing that. So we open with Mr. Mind's corpse stuffed and mounted on display in a museum. Where we were shown it as part of a tour being led by Mr. Talkie Tawney, whose day job is as a museum tour guide. But then a mysterious earthquake happens, and the stuffed Mr. Mind disappears down a fissure in the museum floor. Turns out the real Mr. Mind has been alive all this time, although why he hasn't been active in the intervening years, we don't know. I mean, why he didn't try to take over the world while Captain Marvel and friends were in suspended animation, you'd think it would be easier for him to do that, but nope. He waits until they all come back and can foil him. But anyway, he steals the stuffed Mr. Mind to get his little glasses and radio speaker back. And then he immediately launches on a scheme to destroy half of North America, starting at the Gateway Arch out in St. Louis, Missouri. So there we go. We're reviving another classic Captain Marvel tradition of visiting real American cities and landmarks. We get to see the St. Louis Gateway Arch prominently featured in that story. So Cap thwarts Mr. Mind pretty quickly and asks him point blank, say, how come you're not dead? You were electrocuted back in 1940-something, and Mr. Mind, of course, refuses to tell him. And there's a little teaser caption at the bottom that says, but we'll find out, listeners, in upcoming issues of Shazam. It would actually take a long time before that story was finally told, and when it was in 2 panels. But it almost becomes kind of a running gag in the Shazam series that Mr. Mind keeps on not explaining how he's alive.
I got better.
Burn him anyway!
Now, did he have his voice box?
Yes, he did. Yes, he had. That's why he attacked that museum. He needed to get it back from the stuffed facsimile of him that was on display there.
Nice.
So once he gets his little accessories back in place, he's ready to do some villainy. And then in the backup story in that issue, introduces a character who would be kind of a recurring supporting character in the 70s series, Sonny Sparkle, the nicest kid in the world. And Sonny Sparkle, he has almost like a pheromonal distillation of niceness going on for him. And he is just so adorable and so nice, this kid. He's about Billy's age. He's like 13 years old. And he's just so cute that everybody he meets wants to give him presents. He's a little embarrassed by this. He actually goes out incognito in public. He wears heavy coats and glasses to avoid exposing people to his niceness. so that he's not weighed down with all these gifts. People like give him literally the coats off their backs. They give him cars. He has to have a wagon come around from local charities to haul this stuff away at the end of every week. He's just that burdened with unsolicited gifts from people. So this is the kind of character that one can kind of imagine Captain Marvel meeting in the Golden Age. So Sonny made a few appearances, and Captain Marvel usually had to help him out of jams that he got into as a result of his niceness, and or to help other people out of jams that they get into as a result of their reaction to his niceness. And that story was written by Elliot S. Magan. Note the exclamation point after the S, who is one of my favorite Bronze Age writers, actually. Better known for his Superman stuff, but he's also one of the 3 contributing writers to this 70s volume of Shazam. I think there were actually literally 3 writers who wrote anything for this series, and Magan was one of them.
Wow. And the alliteration is strong, to say the least. Sunny Sparkle.
Yep. In a later issue, he also introduced Sonny's roughneck cousin, Rowdy Sparkle. So he ruined it. Destroyed the magic. All right. Now, in Shazam number 3, here is one of the very few stories that actually addressed in any way whatsoever, even half seriously, the repercussions of Captain Marvel and his friends and supporting cast members and enemies being trapped in this Suspendium bubble for 19 years. For the most part, they was just used as kind of a jokey story device for the first issue, and then just back to good old-fashioned business as usual. Very few stories actually dealt with the problems that might have developed as a result of being out of the loop for 19 years seriously. So in Shazam number 3, we do get we get Billy trying to attend a local dance in 1973. It's a teen hop featuring the music of Joe Cool and the Freaky Geeks. And this is C.C. Beck trying to illustrate for us the youth culture of 1973. And Beck was an old man already in 1973, so his idea of 1970s music was thump, twang, boing. Those are the sound effects that represented the groovy music that were being played at this teen hop that Billy is attending. And he feels very badly out of step with everybody else there. He's wearing brand new clothing, but it doesn't look anything like what teenagers of the day are wearing. And so he gets disheartened and wanders out into the night, and he goes to see old Shazam after this and pleads with old Shazam to allow him to grow up, to turn Billy into an adult, so that he could be the age that he's supposed to be in 1973. And old Shazam obliges, but with the unintended side effect that when the adult Billy, next says Shazam, he turns into a 14-year-old Captain Marvel, which unfortunately puts him at the mercy of a wizard who is disgruntled. He's a teenage wizard who's disgruntled that Wiz TV didn't hire him to do an act on TV. So he starts causing trouble with his magic, which only affects people who are like who are younger than 19, I think is the rule there. So young Captain Marvel can be somewhat affected by his spells. So there's your central conflict, and eventually Billy manages to get the upper hand. He changes back to adult Billy, so the wizard's spells can't affect him, and then just basically spanks this teenage wizard, literally spanks him until he reverses his magic, and yeah. And then teenaged Cap flies back to old Shazam's temple to get him to reverse the effects of the magic. So yeah, so that's one of the very few stories that in any way looks at the consequences of all these people being trapped in Suspendium. For the most part, all the rest of them just go right back to their lives as if nothing had happened for 19 years. And here I was complaining about the 5-year gap in Avengers Endgame.
Well, when I think of a combination of both C.C. Beck and Billy trying to act like one of his fellow hip cool cats, I immediately think of the episode of Portlandia where Steve Buscemi puts on high school clothes and a shirt that reads "Music Band" and carries a skateboard and goes, "How do you do, fellow kids?" That's absolutely the personality and the style that seems to be being broadcasted here.
I've never seen an episode of Portlandia, but that description was vivid enough to give me just the right idea.
Right on.
Oh, yes, it does seem very much like that, but yeah. It's Beck kind of satirizing something he doesn't entirely understand.
and a spanking. So, okay.
Yeah, that's another golden age convention that doesn't really play all that well in the modern age. Let me just make sure that I'm remembering this correctly. Oh, okay. Yep, I'm actually I'm off base. I'm looking in my showcase edition here.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't actually spank the teenage wizard.
Okay.
He just bends his arm behind his back and then lifts the wizard over his head.
Got it.
But there will be some spanking in a later story, though. That I'm positive about.
Yeah, because I thought that Batman was the only one who said Papa Spank, and that was only one issue, and we don't like to talk about that issue.
No, we don't. It's probably better we don't, actually.
Yeah.
So let's see. And then the backup story of Shazam #3 was also by Elliot S. Magan, and it was called The Wizard of Phonograph Hill, and it's introducing an analog to Dr. Thomas Edison, who is named Dr. Thomas Kilowatt. Magan is kind of a scientist fanboy. He worked little tributes to well-known scientists, pioneering scientists and inventors in a lot of his stories. He actually introduced the idea that once a year on Einstein's birthday, Lex Luthor goes to Einstein's grave and falls to his knees and weeps because he feels that he's personally failed Einstein because of his many failures to overcome Superman, thereby proving human intellect's superiority to superhuman brawn.
Wow.
So, yeah, Magan was a scientist fan. So he introduced this Kilowatt character, yet another recurring crackpot scientist type to clutter Captain Marvel's world. Then Shazam #4. This is the return of another classic Golden Age bad guy, Ibak the Cursed, whose secret human identity is Stanley Stinky Printwhistle, who is an up-and-coming criminal back in the Golden Age. He made a deal with the devil to acquire the attributes and the evil might of 4 of the most evil men in history, whose names make up his acronymic name. He has the ability to inspire terror of Ivan the Terrible, the cunning of Cesare Borgia, the fierceness of Attila the Hun, and the cruelty of Caligula. Hence Ibak. So these 4 spirits come back to haunt Mr. Printwhistle, who has gone straight since the 40s. He's not one of the people who was in the Suspendium globe, it turns out. And they get on his case to say his magic word and become Ibak again and go out and challenge Captain Marvel, which he does, and Captain Marvel just does what he always does, easily overpowers Ibak and forces him, gets him in a headlock and squeezes the evil spirits out of him until he says Ibak and turns back to human again. So there's your return of Ibak. And the backup story introduces a one-off character who might have had some interesting potential, but he was only used in this one story. A guy named Conway Mann. Con for short. Con Man. And kind of on the nose because that's exactly what he is.
Yeah.
He runs these little scams, like pretending to be hurt in car accidents and then trying to settle out of court with the driver for money. Turns out he was born on the same day as Billy Batson in the same hospital, and there's kind of a destiny bond between them as a result. Oh, and incidentally, as far as C.C. Beck is concerned, in this story, Billy Batson's birthday is April 1st. Other stories have it as different dates, but the Beck of 1973 thought April 1st was the right thing to have as Billy's birthday. So anyway, the two of them have this strange connection. And Conway Mann, and he's grown to a full-grown adult, and because he wasn't in the Suspendium for 19 years. And when he encounters Billy Batson and he touches his shoulder, he discovers that when he has kind of a dead zone effect happening. He can see the future whenever he's in contact with Billy, and his first thought is to use that for personal gain, but Billy is just so naive and good-hearted, he kind of reforms Conway Mann against his will, and instead he and Billy use this precognitive power to stop a crime and earn a major monetary reward, which he promptly gives away to, they actually cause some property damage in the course of solving the case, so he has to give over the money immediately to pay that off. So that's something that would have been interesting, though, this combination of young and old character, sort of criminally inclined and crime fighter, and how that their powers only work when they're touching one another. Yeah, I would have been interested to know what the reason for this connection was. Maybe the writer of this story, who I'm pretty sure was Magan again, had an idea in mind, but never really explored the matter further. because that's the only story in which that character appeared.
Add that to the long pile of characters that were one-offs in the history of comic books that everybody's like, whatever happened to that guy? And like, absolutely nothing.
Only too true. Yeah, and that's yeah. There's a number of examples of that just in this series.
Yep.
And so Billy, he goes along with what Conway Man wants him to do, and he utters a phrase that becomes kind of like a minor catchphrase for Billy. He says it almost as much as he says "holy moly" in the course of the 70s, and that is, "That sounds logical." No.
Okay, I just came back for "That sounds logical."
That's not exactly the catchiest of catchphrases, but whatever works.
It amused Magan anyway. Yeah, because he was writing, trying to write in the Golden Age style. He was writing lots of absurd little plot twists that people in their right minds, people of a lesser degree of naivete than Billy Batson, would never have accepted. So Magan just kind of, for his own peace of mind, has Billy say things like, "That sounds logical," wink to the audience. Anyway, let's leapfrog straight into Shazam number 6 for a brief second here. And I'm only mentioning that because of the title of the second story in that issue, Dexter Knox and His Electric Grandmother.
That's my favorite band.
Oh my God.
Well, it ought to be.
Yeah, right.
But you got to like their early stuff, though.
Oh, yeah. No. Yeah.
Those were the albums, man.
Weirdly enough, when they went electric, it just wasn't the same.
I guess when they lost the irony, well, anyway. Yeah, so Dexter Knox is a boy genius and one of Billy's closest friends, and he was not shown in Shazam number 1 as having been in the Suspendium, but he must have been, because he's no older than he was in the 40s and 50s, and his grandmother must have been there too, because she'd be dead by now. Let's put it where it's at. But yeah, she accidentally triggers one of Dexter's fantastic inventions and gains electrical powers, and yada, yada, yada. And in the end, Dexter and his grandma win a free trip to Miami. The end. Okay, let's move on to Shazam number 7, which gives us the first focus on Mr. Talkie Tawny of the Bronze Age. And that involves Mr. Tawny helping Captain Marvel foil a jewel smuggler who also happens to own a private zoo. He's kind of an animal collector. And so Mr. Tawny uses his ability to communicate with animals as his in to infiltrate this guy's private zoo and help Billy bust the bad guy. There's one point where Billy, he goes in and tries to interview this guy and asks a few too many questions, and the guy ends up cold-cocking him and binding and gagging him, as the bad guys always do to Billy, and throwing him into a tiger enclosure, dousing him with catnip oil. Mr. Tawny's feral instincts nearly get the better of him, but his fangs tear off Billy's gag just in time, and Billy says Shazam, and the day is saved. And the backup story. This is the first script written by E. Nelson Bridwell in the Shazam series. And Bridwell is a tremendously important figure in the Bronze Age leg of the original Captain Marvel's history. He's the one who probably wrote the single greatest number of scripts for Captain Marvel during this period. He was Julie Schwartz's assistant editor at the time, as indeed he had been assistant editor to DC editor Mort Weisinger for many long, painful, torturous years. And now, under Julie Schwartz, he's kind of coming into his own. He's getting more opportunities to write the kind of stuff he wants to write. And this is the first chance he gets to write one of his very favorite childhood comic book heroes, Captain Marvel. And the story he writes is What's in a Name? Doomsday. And that is the second feature of Shazam number 7. And it's about kind of the power of gossip and rumor. Like, there's a crook holed up in two crooks that are holed up in Ma and Pa Potter's boarding house, and one of them says to the other, "Don't even say the name Captain Marvel, or I'll murderize you." And it starts kind of a whisper down the lane effect throughout the city until everybody thinks that something terrible and catastrophic will happen if somebody so much as mentions the name Captain Marvel. And you can guess there's something of a meta level to this story because it reflects DC's own problems with mentioning the name Captain Marvel, thanks to Marvel Comics. So, and then this was one of those scripts that C.C. Beck acknowledged that, in his opinion, at least at the time. I mean, his attitude kind of retroactively soured about DC, and in the following years and decades, he would claim that all the 70s DC Shazam stories were garbage, and that he was sorry to have been associated with them. But at the time, he actually acknowledged that some of the scripts were of high quality, and he gave DC credit for giving him, as artist, more input to change the stories if he didn't like them. But this was one script that Beck thought had the kind of the Golden Age flavor to it, and he gave Bridwell credit for that. Then Shazam number 8. There was actually no new material in that one. So in my Shazam showcase, just the cover is reproduced, none of the interior pages. But it was the first issue of the Shazam series in the 100-page super spectacular format.
Ah, yes.
Yes, DC throughout the mid to late 70s was experimenting with different issue formats and lengths and price points and so on. And so the 100-page super spectacular was commonly encountered around this time. And it was nothing but Golden Age reprints. But there were one or two pages of bonus material, mostly provided by assistant editor Bridwell, including one letter call of reader mail that consisted entirely of a minor debate over how and if Mary Marvel should be updated for the 70s. You know, what her costume should look like, and especially what to do about her own personal pantheon of Shazam elders. As we know, Shazam stands for a different group of gods for Mary than it did for Billy as Captain Marvel. Like, hers were all goddesses, except for the Z, which was Zephyrus, which is a male deity, actually. So Zephyrus gave Mary Marvel her swiftness, but all the other Shazam elders for her were goddesses, and they gave her traits like grace and beauty, and which are not especially useful in fighting crime.
Were they debating that they wanted Mary Marvel to have a more 70s appropriate outfit, so to speak? What was the essence of this?
There were some readers who were arguing for exactly that. And then there were some other readers who wanted her to look exactly as she did in, like, 1942. So she was originally based on Judy Garland, but her look actually did evolve a little bit. I'll touch on that in a couple of minutes here. So the people who wanted a more modern Mary Marvel won out in the end. But those who were arguing that her power set should be updated so that she didn't have things like beauty and grace in there, that issue was never really revisited. But there were those people in the early going here who thought that it should have been. On to Shazam number 9. Another Mr. Mind story. It's called Worms of the World Unite, in which Mr. Mind gathers up a whole army of worms to he hires a mad scientist who builds a hate amplifier for him, which turns like wickedness and hatred into energy blasts. But Mr. Mind alone was too small to use the helmet, so he had to call a big crowd of worms to get into this helmet thing so they could use it to zap Captain Marvel. And even with millions of worms adding the force of their invertebrate hatred to his, it's still not strong enough to take down the world's mightiest mortal. And there are 2 backup stories. Actually, to this point, there'd been one Golden Age reprint per issue. But for a while here, after the 100-page Super Spectacular of number 8, which featured a bunch of important Golden Age reprints, we don't have reprints in the monthly issues of Shazam anymore. We have 3 new stories per issue. So there's a backup story written by Magan, which... oh, wait a minute. Actually, that might have been written by O'Neill. Well, anyway... it involves Billy Batson at Station Whiz. He's filming a TV show there, co-starring with a young girl named Trixie and her pet chimp, Bonzo. He's wearing a turban, which has a giant prop jewel in it, which, unbeknownst to anyone, has magic properties, so that when Billy says Shazam, the magic lightning bolt ricochets off the gem and strikes everybody else in the room except him. So Mr. Morris gets Shazam powers, Trixie gets Shazam powers, the chimp gets Shazam powers, and the rest of the story is just Cap trying to track down this chimp and revert it to its normal, non-powered state. The title of the story is, aptly enough, Captain Marvel Goes Ape.
Of course. Another hallowed addition to the ape canon.
Yes, because apes sell comics.
I noticed Dave Cockrum had early work on this.
Yes. That was the other backup story in this issue. It turns out that both the backup stories in this issue were written by Elliot S. Magan. The one featuring Captain Marvel Jr. was called The Mystery of the Missing Newsstand. It was written by Magan with art by a fairly young Dave Cockrum, who was a fan of Captain Marvel back in the day. I mentioned that he provided, early fan art of his of Captain Marvel was used as the cover to Back Issue Magazine number 93. And he would have loved to do more Captain Marvel Jr. stories for DC. Cap Jr. was, more specifically, Macra Boy, the artist who drew a lot of Captain Marvel Jr. stories, was a big influence on a lot of later professional comics artists. So Cockrum was delighted to draw this story of Cap Jr. and would have liked to draw more, but then the X-Men gig came up at Marvel, and so he found himself suddenly indisposed.
And the rest was history.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
Macra, is it Mac or Macra Boy?
I'm pretty sure Mac. I mean, his name was Emmanuel or Emmanuel or something like that, but Mac was just his American nickname. So I'm pretty sure it would be Mac.
Those listeners interested in comic history, the name Murd just mentioned is a towering figure when it comes to the Fawcett characters, and he did other work as well outside of Fawcett. But I mean, the covers he would paint, I mean, his style was incredible. A very talented man. There's been various books about his career that have come out in recent years, but a very important figure that I need to learn more about.
Unrelated, but every time Mr. Mind comes up, one of these days I'm going to have to tweet at They Might Be Giants and ask them if Mr. Mind was the inspiration for the song Dr. Worm. One of my favorite They Might Be Giants songs, and the two just equate in my head wonderfully.
I can't help thinking of Mr. Mime, especially after having seen Detective Pikachu recently.
Best scene in the movie.
I may agree. All right. So anyway, that thing with Magan and Cockrum was the first Captain Marvel Jr. solo story of the 70s. All right. And moving on to Shazam number 10. Now, that contains the first Mary Marvel solo story of the 70s. That was drawn by Bob Oxner, who was joining the Shazam creators.
Murd, may I interject for a moment? Because I have to have this moment. May I?
Okay, go ahead.
Invasion of the Salad Men. Okay, thank you.
Yes. All right. Well, we'll backtrack to that in a second. That is an important topic. Silly as it sounds, it actually is important. But yeah, so the first Mary Marvel solo story, it was drawn by Bob Oxner. This is his first Shazam art. It's one of two stories he had to draw in this issue, as it turns out. I'll get back to that in a second. But he drew the Mary Marvel story in a style that was more his own. It was a Thanksgiving-themed story, and it featured Mary Marvel trying to stop some bad guys who were trying to commit a robbery on Thanksgiving. It was written by E. Nelson Bridwell, and Oxner was more comfortable drawing Mary in a style that was less a swipe of C.C. Beck and more his own stuff. And he did update Mary's look a little bit. When she first appeared back in the 40s, she was modeled on Judy Garland. But Oxner took more of a Nancy Drew approach. I could also compare her to actress Susan Day of the Partridge Family. Oh. Just her the hairstyle she was sporting and the cut of her dress. So there was that. But yeah, getting back then to Invasion of the Salad Men. Yes, and thank you for the wonderfully intoned reading of that title.
Oh,
Chris.
I live for that, my friend.
Yes, this is a story that was written by Elliot S. Magan, and it is a somewhat silly one. It's as the title implies, it's a bunch of alien beings who happen to resemble salad vegetables, and their spacecraft crashes on Earth, and they very politely ask some passersby where they might acquire some replacement parts for their craft, and everyone automatically assumes that they're here to invade them, since I guess that's happened a lot on Earth as over the years. But they respond very irrationally to these very well-mannered little humanoid vegetables. Everybody but Captain Marvel, who with his wisdom of Solomon quickly determines that they're no threat to anybody. So in the end, he has to give the people what they're expecting, and he leans into this whole idea of an invasion of the salad men, and he and the vegetable aliens make a movie together, which they then sell to some Hollywood producer and release to a limited number of theaters, and make enough money from doing this that the salad men can afford replacement parts for their spaceship and return to their home planet. That's what the Invasion of the Salad Men is all about. It is awfully silly. I really don't think that silliness is that incompatible with similar silliness encountered in the whimsical days of the Golden Age. with the old Captain Marvel stories back then. But one person who definitely disagrees with that perspective is C.C. Beck, because this was kind of the end of the rope of Beck's rope here. This Salad Men story and another one that we'll see in the following issue, Shazam number 11, Beck refused to draw it, and that's just not something that an artist for hire did. I mean, even today, it's kind of hard for an artist to get away with that kind of arrogance and still be employed. But sure enough, that is what Beck did. And not only did he refuse to draw it, he didn't just mail the script back. He took the 2 scripts he refused to draw. He deemed them unusable. I think he might actually have written that on the scripts when he returned them. He returned them in person, and not even to Julie Schwartz or Nelson Bridwell, his editors, but to DC Vice President Saul Harrison when he saw him in person at a convention in New York.
He must have had not many bridges left standing by the end of his career.
Yeah, he had. I don't think he really wanted that much to be working in comics anymore at that point. So he was just kind of letting himself out. But yeah, he refused to draw the Invasion of the Salad Men story. So that was technically the first Shazam story that Bob Oxner drew. And he was asked by the editors to imitate Beck's style as closely as he could. And he doesn't do a bad job of it either. Yeah, Oxner is kind of a well-known member of DC's stable from the 60s and 70s, too. He's known for his rendering of attractive women. So it's kind of fitting that he's also handling the Mary Marvel stories. And Oxner also drew the cover to Shazam number 10. Now, this is the first issue that ran without a C.C. Beck cover. Now, there is one C.C. Beck drawn story in Shazam number 10, and that features the return of a Golden Age villainous Aunt Minerva, the elderly crime lord, elderly and man-hungry. So it's another, kind of in the vein of Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer. This is a kind of humor that's probably not that acceptable in the modern day. But yes, Aunt Minerva is at her geriatric and lusty best here in the final Captain Marvel story that Beck drew for DC.
Murd, let me reassure you for a moment. After what I saw earlier, Fat Man the Flying Human Saucer is always going to be acceptable to me.
Happy to hear it, Chris, because those few issues are kind of on my long-term shopping list for convention shopping.
And to quote The Simpsons, as I always love to do, you don't win friends with salad.
I've never seen anyone do that. It's true. Yeah, they sure as heck didn't win C.C. Beck's friendship with salad.
No, they did not.
All right, and that moves us along to Shazam number 11, which is the first issue of the series that went on without any input from C.C. Beck at all. So in this story, we have in this issue we have the world's mightiest dessert, which features wacky inventor and. Yeah, I have to save some surprises for you guys. I didn't mention this one in the outline.
I'm glad you did.
This involves wacky scientist and part-time pharmacist Doc Quartz. He runs a drugstore, which is, it's a classic like Woolworth-style drugstore, which is also like a soda shop. He invents a form of cherry gelatin that just reproduces itself infinitely. And so Captain Marvel and all the good citizens of the city have to eat it in order to defeat it.
So this is like a version of the Blob in a sense.
Yeah. Except it doesn't try to eat anybody. Everybody just has to eat it. And then there's also a Christmas story in this issue, The Year Without a Christmas, in which the Savannah family schemes to accelerate time so that Christmas passes in the blink of an eye. Yes, that it does hit close to home for me. It's true. But fear not, goodness prevails in the end, and the Marvel family helps Santa Claus defeat Savannah and his nefarious device. And the middle story, this is important for a couple of reasons. It's called The Incredible Cape Man. And the titular Cape Man is actually a mild-mannered mailman named Herschel Dockles. And, playing into mid-70s attitudes and stereotypes about life in the big city. And you know all about that, Ian. The urban fear.
Hey, I'm walking here.
Something like that. Just fear of the crime rates and urban blight and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Herschel Dockles is afraid to make his daily rounds in the city So he mail orders a costume, which is basically a Superman costume with a C instead of an S and like a striped balaclava ski mask to go with it. And he hits the streets as the Incredible Cape Man because he thinks this costume is going to give him heightened confidence or something. And Captain Marvel ends up having to, save him from some criminals that he foolishly tries to apprehend. So this story is important because, A, it's the other script that C.C. Beck returned as unusable, and B, because it's the first Captain Marvel script of the 70s to be penciled by the aforementioned Kurt Schaffenberger, finally returning to the Marvel fold and penciling his first Captain Marvel story in a couple of decades. And Mr. Schaffenberger would make his presence very strongly felt for the rest of this run and beyond. All right, now we're going to take a little sidestep here from the Shazam series and talk about a Shazam-related issue that came out at about this point in the sequence, around the time Shazam number 11 was on stands, and that's the Superman series, number 276, cover dated June 1974.
The story you thought we'd never dare print.
How very daring of them.
Yeah, that's what it says on the front cover. The story you thought we'd never dare print. The fight to decide the superhero championship of the world. And the cover image has been often aped, imitated, homaged, take your pick of verb. But it shows Superman and a figure in a red and yellow costume, very much like Captain Marvel's, but not quite, speeding towards each other in midair, heading towards a collision. And so it's kind of promising something like a Superman Captain Marvel battle.
Yeah, I can picture this cover. I guess I always just assumed it was Captain Marvel, but as you note here, it actually isn't.
Yep. If you look carefully, the thing that it's kind of like one of those try and find puzzles. What can you spot the 19 mistakes in this image? The most noticeable one is that this Captain Marvel knockoff has kind of a big yellow starburst on his chest instead of a lightning bolt.
That's right. Yep.
But literally everything else is almost exactly the same, even down to the cape.
Yeah.
But here's what I don't understand, Murd. So you note here that, so it's 1974. They've been publishing the book now for over a year, and they still don't have full usage rights. Can you clarify, elaborate, what does that even mean?
They were not yet, they hadn't yet gotten clearance to have Captain Marvel a licensed character at that point. DC didn't yet own him outright.
Okay.
They didn't yet have clearance to use Captain Marvel in the same comic with their own characters.
Oh, okay.
Or at least certain characters. Superman, for example. Any character that carried its own trademark and starred in its own comic. Eventually, we will see Captain Marvel appearing in the same comic with one of Superman's enemies. But Superman himself had not yet been legally cleared.
Got it.
So that's why Elliot S. Magan, who was the writer of this story, came up with this Captain Marvel doppelganger to fight Superman in this issue. The creative team here is Magan, plus penciler Kurt Swan, plus inker Bob Oxner, plus editor Julie Schwartz. So everybody but Swan was already involved with Captain Marvel's 70s adventures anyway. So the story is entitled Make Way for Captain Thunder, which is kind of a callback to the cover blurb on Captain Marvel's first appearance in Whiz Comics number 2, Gangway for Captain Marvel. And Captain Thunder, we must remember, was actually one of the original working names for the character that eventually became called Captain Marvel. Captain Thunder was like his prototype name. So there is a certain history involved there. So in this story, Captain Thunder blunders into Earth 1 from whatever parallel Earth he comes from. Elliot Magan retells his origin, which, as I note here in my outline, is kind of like what I imagine Captain Marvel's origin might have been if it had been written in 1954. Like if the Captain Marvel character had begun where his stories ended. So it's modified in such a way that it's sort of more in keeping with the storytelling of that decade. Like, for example, there was no the old Shazam is not involved here. Captain Thunder gets his powers from an old American Indian medicine man. So it's more like something that might have come out of like the popular Western comics of the day. And his magic word is, of course, thunder, and it's an acronym for a bunch of powers that I'm not going to bother to list here, but in the interest of time. And he rubs his magic belt buckle, which has a little lightning bolt insignia on it. Captain Thunder's real name is young orphan Willie Fawcett. He works at Wham TV instead of Whiz. And instead of holy moly, his catchphrase is creepies. So, fun little touches that Megan threw in there.
Jiminy Jillikers.
That word has become entirely meaningless. Yeah, and he uses creepies almost often enough in this comic to become meaningless too. He hits that pretty hard. So anyway, the shtick here is he ends up in Superman's universe because he went up against a group of bad guys called the Monster League of Evil. Not the Monster Society of Evil, but the Monster League. And they look like just like universal monsters, Frankenstein and Dracula and so forth. And they put some kind of magic spell on him that will turn him evil every time he calls on his Captain Thunder identity. So that's what he does. On arrival on Earth 1, he finds Superman fighting some crooks, becomes Captain Thunder, and immediately finds himself compelled to help the crooks instead of capture them. And that's how he and Superman find themselves locked in combat. The battle ends in something of a stalemate. Superman pins Captain Thunder's arms behind him and just holds him still until finally whatever wisdom powers Captain Thunder has prevails, and he's able to overcome the magic brainwashing he's under. And he uses his powers to somehow get himself back home to his native universe.
And do we ever see Captain Thunder again?
I'm glad you asked that, Chris. I kind of wish we had, because this is one of my favorite stories of the 70s. It's one of my favorite Superman stories, and it is just a favorite of mine, period. But apparently, another thing I hadn't known until I started doing research for this episode, Elliot Magan actually planned to do a sequel of sorts to this, to run in Action Comics number 576, 11 years later. It was going to come out around the time of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it would reintroduce us to Willie Fawcett and his alter ego, who by that time would have been promoted to Colonel Lightning. Changed his name for some reason. There's a feature about this in, I think, Back Issue Magazine number 10. Because back then they were doing a feature called The Greatest Stories Never Told, about comic scripts that never
Right,
found
I remember that one.
publication.
Yeah, we have to reiterate to listeners how, like, the spotlights Murd does or I do, you can't do them without tomorrows.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the wealth of information they provide in their one-shot books and their monthly publications it has no peer.
An absolute argosy of background information.
Yeah.
And Chris, the name Captain Thunder did reappear, if not William Fawcett himself. That was the name of the combined character that the different Marvel family characters would become in the Flashpoint universe. When they would scream Shazam, they would turn into Captain Thunder.
Ian. All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, on that note, I have to depart because I have to actually go to bed soon because the final grinding month of school beckons me.
No problem.
We understand perfectly, Chris.
Murd, this is tremendous. I encourage everybody to keep your seatbelt on because there's so much great stuff ahead, like Gregory Gosharudi. The world's dullest mortal. I mean, Murd, I got to give you props, man. The research here is just one gem after another.
Well, thank you, Chris. Once
immensely
again,
entertaining notes.
You gave me a great example to follow.
Honored. All right, brothers, I will leave this in your capable hands, and we'll all talk soon.
All right. Take care, sir.
Good night, gentlemen. Take care.
Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Now, before we get off this issue, Murd, I'd love to find out someday, because I guarantee you that there somewhere along the lines in this story, they must have thought they had the full rights to Captain Marvel, because I don't understand why this story would exist outside of that. You would think that they would have just straight up waited a couple of months until they 100% knew that they were able to use the character, and just, rather than create this whole new version of Captain Marvel when they themselves were literally printing Captain Marvel comics on a monthly basis. It's a very strange case.
It is, and I can't claim to know the full details behind it or behind the editorial thinking.
Right.
But it does. I don't think this is something that they had just written up and then plugged in this new character in the middle of it. I think it was written from the ground up with the idea that they were going to use this Captain Marvel doppelganger instead.
Got it.
Because it's a fairly well thought out origin sequence.
Yeah.
It's clearly playing off nostalgia for Captain Marvel and his own history. But it just, for whatever reason, at this point, DC did not yet have the ability to draw on that history itself just to pay tribute to it.
Fair enough.
All right, so let's dive back in here. So that was the first of several Superman and Captain Marvel teases we would get until finally, in 1978, we got the full-on slobber knocker that we were all hoping for. All right, getting back into the Shazam series proper. Issue number 12. Now, with that issue, the series became, it had been bi-monthly pretty much this whole time, but it went to a bi-monthly 100-page format. So every issue for a little while here, starting in number 12, was 100 pages with at least 20 pages of new content per bi-monthly issue, plus a bunch of Golden Age reprints and other little surprises thrown in mostly by E. Nelson Bridwell, profile pages, fact sheets, etc., usually assembled around a central theme for each issue. So our first time out here at number 12. Now, the only really noteworthy thing I have here as far as content for issue number 12 is that it had another Captain Marvel Jr. solo story written by Magan with art by Dick Giordano. Another noteworthy who probably had wanted to pay his own tribute to Macro Boy by drawing Captain Marvel Jr. And that story introduces us to, for the one and only time, the aforementioned Gregory Gasharuti, the world's dullest mortal. That so intrigued Chris. And Gregory Gasharuti is kind of on the order of Sonny Sparkle. He's just a kid with a borderline superhuman attribute. Whereas Sonny is so nice, everyone wants to give him stuff. Gregory is just so dull and dull-witted and unexceptional that nobody notices him, even when they're standing right next to him. So he's kind of got functional invisibility going for him. And in this story, a group of crooks try to put that to work for them by using him to steal some secret document or other for them. But Captain Marvel Jr., with the wisdom of Solomon, is able to perceive Gregory for what he is. And Gregory doesn't mean any harm. He's just happy that these criminals are willing to talk to him, since so few people bother. So that's our fun little Captain Marvel Jr. backup there. I think that's about the only Giordano art we got in this series.
Well, I want to point out, too, that this 100 pages of content was only 60 cents.
It was a different time.
Yes, it was. Very much so.
All right, let's see here. Then let's see. Okay, skipping over number 13. In Shazam number 14. Now this, instead of giving us 2 or 3 news stories, it was just one long, 20-page thriller. The Marvel family. Now this is Cap, Mary, and Jr. together. Even Uncle Marvel thrown in there for good measure. Versus the Reformed Monster Society of Evil, making their first of a couple reincarnations of themselves here in the Bronze Age. Mr. Mind, of course, was at the center of this. It was basically Mr. Mind plus Dr. Savannah and his 2 evil children plus Ibak the Cursed. And there's some fun background stuff happening with Ibak flirting with Georgia Savannah. The 2 of them are kind of made for each other. Mr. Mind has put together this giant death ray projector thing, and the Monster Society takes it out on the street to try to use it against the unsuspecting populace. The Marvel family scuttles that scheme almost immediately, but Savannah himself is the only member of the society to escape, and he takes Uncle Marvel hostage. He heads back to Mr. Mind's hideout, where he discovers a little scale model, like a miniature model of the death ray machine, which had the unexpected ability to materialize dream images from a person's mind. It accidentally hooks itself up to Uncle Marvel when he falls asleep there in the hideout, and it brings to life these horrible mythological creatures that Uncle has been dreaming about with Savannah's head. Uncle Marvel's been reading a book about mythology, and he's also got Savannah on the brain because he's just kidnapped him. So this machine brings to life these nightmares Uncle Marvel is having of mythological beasts with Savannah's head on them. And these things then go on the rampage, and because they're dreams made flesh, they're not entirely real. Therefore, the Marvel family can't quite touch them enough to punch them, but they can do some real property damage. So the Marvel family have to use their heads to solve this problem. What they do is they pretend to surrender to Savannah, sneak into the hideout, and then they slip Uncle Marvel a book about the Marvel family so that he reads that and falls asleep and materializes dream versions of the Marvel family that can then beat up the Savannah-headed monsters and save the day. So if you're an Uncle Marvel fan, this story's got the goods.
Clearly, this is where the concept for Inception came from. It was this comic.
Without a doubt, yeah. Just images of the Whiz radio building just folding in on itself,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And we finally get to see Uncle Marvel, or at least a dream avatar of him, with superpowers flying into the fray. So it's a proud moment for that character anyway. And it's also kind of the return of the Monster Society, so it's important for that reason, at least.
Only in his dreams. Only in his dreams.
As real as they may seem, it was only in his dreams.
And the next issue's a big one, huh?
It is, yeah. Yeah, this is the 100-page Shazam number 15. And we mentioned earlier, this is the first one to have the world's mightiest mortal on the cover, as opposed to the original Captain Marvel. Mm-hmm. Marvel Comics finally had their way there. But yeah, this is the first interaction between Captain Marvel and his friends and foes on their parallel Earth, which I might add has not yet been named so far in the Shazam series. It's not really been fully established at this point that there's any possibility of Captain Marvel and friends interacting with other DC characters. But this is the first issue that at least takes a step in the direction of grounding Captain Marvel and his world in the DC Multiverse. Mm-hmm. We finally get to see him interact with another DC character, that being Lex Luthor. Now, Luthor has worked up a doohickey called a magical accumulator. His plan is to use his science to gather ambient magical energy that he can then use against Superman, since it's one of Superman's few weaknesses that Luthor has not yet tried to exploit. So he uses this handheld gimmick he calls his magic accumulator. He decides he's going to use it to destroy a silly comic book one of his henchmen has left lying around, which happens to be a Shazam comic book. So he zaps the comic book with his accumulator, and it ends up shunting him into Captain Marvel's world, which is not really described as a parallel Earth or anything like that. Luthor wonders to himself, am I in another dimension? Or have I just been magically transported into this world of fiction by my own magic accumulator? It's left kind of ambiguous. Yeah. Because DC, even now, was not yet ready to commit to the Marvels being a full part of their publishing diegesis. But anyway, for better or worse, Luthor is in Captain Marvel's world. He teams up with Mr. Mind against Cap. They have this scheme worked out where they trap Billy in a hammerhead shark tank at the local aquarium. But Billy gets out of that, as he always does. And in the end, Luthor is sent right back. I think by his own hand, actually. He's had enough of the craziness that goes on Earth S. But again, it's not called Earth S just yet. And finds his way back to his home dimension where he says, bah, enough of that. I hope that was all a dream. He pretty much convinces himself it was all a dream. But he still has his magic accumulator, and he's planning to just try again. But on the final panel, there's kind of an image of the corner of a cape and one red boot. Superman, for the reasons I cited before, I don't think Superman was allowed to appear inside the comic, but he is just like this tiny little partial cameo on the last panel to show that, hey, Lex Luthor has been captured and all's well. So there you go. Also to be encountered in this issue, actually, I'm sorry, this happened in number 14. I missed it in my notes. But E. Nelson Bridwell began providing little profile pages on the different Shazam elders. He was kind of a walking encyclopedia of all kinds of world mythology, ancient and modern. He knew a lot about ancient Greek myths, and he knew a lot about Superman and Captain Marvel comics of the 40s. So he was just kind of a walking omnibus. And he used that knowledge to provide readers with some background on the 6 mythological gods and heroes on whom Captain Marvel calls for his powers. So it's like 1 page each for Solomon, and then 1 for Hercules, and so forth. So that's a little added value thing that E. Nelson Bridwell threw into these 100-page issues of Shazam.
I dig that. Yeah. Text pieces don't get as much love as they should in comic books, especially as additional content thrown in there for the hell of it.
Oh, I wholly agree. In the old days, even the publishers didn't take them seriously. They were just thrown in there to qualify their comics as magazines, so they qualified for like a lower postal rate.
Yep.
But yeah, they have value of their own. I absolutely agree with you there.
Oh yeah.
And also in Shazam number 15, there was a 2-page test spread for something that Bridwell had been wanting to do for some time, a sequel to the classic Golden Age Tour of Cities, which was a series of Captain Marvel stories in which he would visit this or that American metropolis and see, local landmarks, interact with local people, people who were like newscasters or magazine distributors, just people that Fawcett was trying to kiss up to, basically. Got little cameos in those Tour of City stories. And so in a little 2-page spread in Shazam number 15, Bridwell kind of floated to the readers the idea of doing this again, showing like little excerpted panels from those classic stories of the 40s. And he would eventually get his wish, as we will see. Shazam number 16. I mentioned that each of these 100-page spectaculars had a central theme. Number 16 was the deadly enemies of man. There were a couple of, each story. I think there were 7 stories in that issue, and each one was kind of introduced by a different deadly enemy of man. And the lead-in story was a new one, hosted by Injustice. And then we come to the end of this little run of 100-page spectaculars with number 17. Now, this is one that I kind of wish you'd been able to see, Ian, because it introduces, as you see in my outline here, it introduces a character called Allegro Scruff, who is the pied unpiper of crime. He's not a criminal himself, just the opposite, in fact. He's just a good-natured, easygoing dude who walks around wearing sandals and bell-bottom jeans, and he carries like this miniature Moog synthesizer that plays magic notes that allow him to attract criminals and make them dance to his tune. Huh. So as a public service, he actually rounds up all the criminals around the sleepy suburban town of Greenville. And Captain Marvel personally congratulates him for doing this and then takes off. But then Allegro Scruff is told by the local police chief that they can't quite deliver on the $1 million they promised him for doing this. The best they can do is $28 and a free ticket to the policeman's ball.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, Scruff is not happy about that, so he kind of retaliates by using his magical machine to summon alien supercriminals to the planet Earth, who set about stealing, respectively, smog, chocolate, and the color green. This is...
That sounds like the brought to you by at the end of a Sesame Street episode. I mean, come on, that's so out there.
It seems like a story that would amuse somebody with the substance consumption habits that somebody who dresses like Allegro Scruff might have.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. And I mean, really, they should have tried harder. They should have thrown in like a stick of gum or like or like some sort of hemp belt or something like that. Maybe
Pringles, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. You never know.
Yeah, but in the end. The Marvels and the alien criminals back where they came from. But one of the criminals... They managed to arrange a bargain with one of the criminals who then gives these aliens that show up on Earth. They're happy enough that they make a bargain with the Marvel family and give them $1 million worth of diamonds so that Allegro Scruff can finally get his $1 million. And his response was, "Oh, okay, that's cool. Hand the rocks to charity. I don't dig money, man." The whole thing, it was never about the money with Allegro Scruff. It was about the recognition, the appreciation, He felt slighted. That's what this was all about. So he just hands the bag of diamonds back to the Marvel family and goes off to start up a band.
Damn hippie.
Well, the reason I wanted you to see this, though, Ian, is because if you ever get a chance to see this issue, check out the character design on Allegro Scruff and tell me that he doesn't look exactly like a young Rusty Venture in his college years.
Oh boy. Okay. All right. I'm using the power of the internet right now. Let me see if I can get a solid image of him. Let's see. Allegro Scruff. Oh, you ain't kidding. Oh boy, yeah, wow. Part of me feels like now that may have been very well where they got the inspiration for Rusty. Oh my God, that is on the money.
Yeah, I wouldn't put that past Jackson Public and Doc Hammer. Their influences are many, diverse, and obscure.
Yeah, it also kind of looks like an older Shaggy.
Well, yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Letting his hair grow out even further.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like in a couple of years where he needs corrective lenses and has a little bit further of a beard, that would absolutely be what Shaggy looked like.
All right. So that's fun. And that very Dr. Venture-like artwork is provided, of course, by Kurt Schaffenberger.
Very nice.
All right. So back to the more standard 32-page length. In Shazam number 18, the lead story was the celebrated Talking Frog of Blackstone Forest, which is a Mr. Tawny story. It's your classic frog prince yarn. He meets a talking frog who claims to be an enchanted prince, but he, within his social circle, can talk to animals, so Mr. Tawny is having a hard time convincing anyone of the truth of this. And for a B story, we've got the first meetup between Captain Marvel Jr. and Sivana Jr. of the Bronze Age. Savannah Jr. uses a hypno coin to place a post-hypnotic suggestion that keeps Freddie Freeman from saying the name of his hero, Captain Marvel, and transforming into Cap Jr. But Cap Jr., Freddie gets around this by saying his own name, which happens to contain all the same syllables as Captain Marvel. And so that's his loophole. He changes into Cap Jr. and beats Savannah Jr. up. Good.
That sounds like it shouldn't work.
That sounds logical.
Yeah, exactly. like Fred E. No, I don't know about that, man. But all right, fine.
Well,
sure.
No, he says Captain. When I say his own name, I mean Captain Marvel Jr.
Oh,
that contains
okay.
the name Captain Marvel within it.
Got it. All right. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, because I was trying to think like, wait, how does that work? But then that makes it even stupider because so he can't say Captain Marvel, but he can as long as there's a whatever.
It's fun. It's whimsy.
Sure it is. Just turn off your brain a little bit and read some comics, damn it.
That's just what they're hoping the kiddies would do in those days. And that is the thing. I mean, they were going fairly explicitly for a younger audience. Bob Oxner said as much in an interview some years later.
Yeah.
Which is a funny thing because they were trying very self-consciously to trade on nostalgia for the Golden Age stories, and yet aiming themselves at an audience that was too young to feel nostalgia for those stories. So kind of makes you wonder a little bit who this series was for. But it must have been for somebody because it sold fairly well. The first issue in particular sold many, many copies, although a lot of those were to speculator types, which did exist even back in the early 70s.
Sure, yeah.
And it lasted a good, as a self-contained solo title, it lasted a good 5 years and 30-some issues. So it's by early 70s standards, it was something of a success.
Yeah, not too shabby.
So, as strange and counterintuitive as the formula seemed to be, somebody was buying it.
Yep.
All right. In Shazam number 19, we're introduced to a Mixius Pitlick-like. Jeez, that's how you know it's getting late, when I lose the ability to pronounce Mixius Pitlick. But yeah, he was an alien juvenile delinquent from another dimension, very much like Mixius Pitlick. His name was Zazo. And he comes to Captain Marvel's Earth for some fun, pretty much the same reason Mixius Pitlick always bothers Superman. And unlike Mixius Pitlick, he doesn't have reality warping superpowers. He has no powers at all, just a few samples of his dimension's super science, including a special kind of hat. It looks like the old Prussian helmet, the Pickelhaube. You've seen him. It's a helmet with a big metal spike coming right out of the middle of it.
Yes, I have.
Yes, okay. He wears one of those. And it has the ability to draw Billy's magic lightning into itself, so that the first time Billy says Shazam while Zazo was around wearing this helmet, it siphons off his lightning, literally steals Billy's thunder, and it changes Zazo into a superpowered Captain Marvel-like entity calling itself Zazo Plus, wearing like a reverse Flash version of Captain Marvel's costume, yellow suit with red lightning bolt. And he causes mischief and vandalism and all that stuff until, he takes off the helmet, first of all, so that Cap can't just say Shazam again and cause a second lightning bolt to change Zazo Plus back to normal Zazo. Instead, the lightning bolt goes down and changes Cap back into Billy, and then Zazo Plus gags Billy so that he can't say the word again. And, Billy goes and seeks out Freddy, and using a second member of the Marvel family, he's able to find a way around this predicament. And in the end, this is when we get to that spanking I promised you earlier, Ian.
Yeah.
Because when Zazo Plus is reverted through Billy and Freddy's trickery back into his normal teenage self, that is when Cap comes and takes young Zazo over his knee, very graphically. And then Zazo's dad shows up and says, "That's exactly the punishment I would prescribe, Captain Marvel." So it's with parental permission. So I guess in the 70s, that's good enough.
Zazo, in character likeness, kind of looks like a more childish Sinestro, like even in his hairline.
Oh yeah, he's got the pink skin and the pointed ears and a bit of a widow's peak going on.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little more of the Wonder Twins from Super Friends, though.
Yeah, I could see that as well. Yeah, definitely.
He's got those weird little curly Q sideburns happening.
Yeah.
But so there we are. The Cap gets a little Mixus Pitlick imp action. And then there's a Mary Marvel backup story, which introduces a new status quo for everybody's favorite roly-poly wannabe Marvel, Uncle Marvel. He actually goes somewhat legit and gets his own kiddie show on Station Wiz TV. The Uncle Marvel show. His name sounds like he ought to be a kiddie show host anyway. But he is then blackmailed by a mysterious person. He says he's set up a bomb in Station Wiz, and he will detonate it and kill everyone inside unless Uncle Marvel helps him pull off a daring heist using Uncle Marvel's fantastic Shazam powers that he doesn't really have. So Uncle Marvel sends out an SOS to Mary Marvel, who mimics all of it. She underwrites him, basically, and helps him. Creates the illusion that Uncle Marvel is doing these superpowered feats to steal a painting for this Mad Bomber type. It's a painting called The Smiling Swordsman, and it turns out that the Mad Bomber loves the painting so much that he styled himself after the Smiling Swordsman in the painting and wears a fancy musketeer costume and fights with a sword and everything. He doesn't last more than like 5 seconds against Mary Marvel, though, once his true nature's been revealed. But it's kind of like Mary and Uncle Marvel versus like the Earth S version of the Batman villain, the Cavalier. And Uncle Marvel gets his own TV show, and his connection with Station Wiz will be played up a little more as the series moves on into a new evolutionary stage.
Uncle Marvel on TV, that's something that would never happen again.
Or would it? Okay, well, moving on now to issue number 20, which is a full issue. I mean, it's the issue-length mystery story involving Cap, Mary, and Junior together. It was called The Strange and Terrible Disappearance of Maxwell's Zodiac, and it's kind of a peculiar little riddle-type story. And it's a riddle that was never really completely answered. And I think that was kind of a deliberate creative choice on the part of writer Elliot S. Maggin. This was his final Shazam work, although he didn't know that at the time. He was a freelancer on the book. And he was kind of bummed out, actually, when after the little hibernatory period that the series was about to go into, as we'll see in a second, he was never tapped again to write Shazam. He was disappointed because he said he had a blast doing it. And I'm kind of disappointed, too, because, as I've said, Maggin is one of my favorite Bronze Age writers. But this is where Captain Marvel and Maggin part company. And now we come into a place where I guess sales had dipped far enough that Captain Marvel and company were about to climb back into the Suspendium for a little bit, because for 4 issues, issues 21 through 24, Shazam was demoted to a quarterly reprint title.
Yeah, boy.
Just a 32-page comic of nothing but Golden Age reprints. It spent pretty much a year in limbo that way, 4 quarterly issues. So things looked pretty bleak for this Bronze Age revival of Captain Marvel and his friends. But then, charging in on a white stallion, and I didn't even mention this in my notes, but it was really Jeanette Kahn more than anybody else that pulled Captain Marvel's bacon out of the fire.
Huh.
See, this was all happening in that magical year of 1976. And Jeanette, that was the year that National Periodical Publications officially became DC Comics, and it was the year that Jeanette Kahn was brought in and made the publisher of DC Comics.
Wow.
So she was kind of co-regent of the company in a position of near equal power with President Saul Harrison. And she was the one who was really agitating for some proactive change at the company. And she had a lot of, in hindsight, very good ideas. I mean, people who were working at DC at the time didn't all think so. And she got a lot of pushback, not for nothing, probably not least because she happened to be a woman. And also because she was a woman who had had no real prior experience working in comics. But still, I think history has borne out that a lot of the ideas that she had for revitalizing this stale old boys club that was DC Comics were proved to be good ideas. One of the things that she really hit hard as a publisher of DC, one of her chief agenda items was that she disliked reprints. She thought they were a waste of page count and didn't give the readers enough for their buck. So she did her best to eliminate reprint titles and reprint filler in monthly comics. And she also wanted to see DC do some more relevant things to the time, and just some more like licensed tie-in type stuff. And she saw this Shazam series that was languishing in reprints, something that, as I've just said, she didn't care for. And she saw a real missed opportunity there because, this was 1976, and the Shazam TV show had been a Saturday morning success for like 2 years now. Mm-hmm. And she thought, well, by golly, we ought to have a comic book that ties in a little more with this Shazam TV show that prospective comic book buyers might be familiar with, and it might make them more inclined to pick up a comic book based on this Shazam concept if it were tied in more with the TV series. So she really pushed for the Shazam series to be brought out of its stale, repetitive cycle of reprints and brought back into relevance as a DC TV comic. And that was a little mini line that DC launched in 1976. So Shazam was revitalized as one of those four. The other three being a comic based on the Shazam TV series sister show, Isis. Mm-hmm. And there was also the Super Friends comic and Welcome Back, Kotter.
Signed
the oddball of the group there.
Signed Epstein's mother.
Oh. Miss Khan.
Oh man, now I have the damn Barbarino song stuck in my head. All right.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Yeah.
It'll get out soon enough. I'll replace it with something once we're done here.
All right, let's move on quickly in that case.
Yes.
All right. So Shazam number 25, cover dated September-October 1976. Shazam came out of reprint limbo, and that issue contained two different stories. The lead story, the cover story, is one of those few stories not reprinted in the Shazam Showcase volume because it was really not so much a Shazam story as it was an Isis story with a brief Captain Marvel cameo. It was pretty much a backdoor pilot for the upcoming Isis series, which would last a whopping 8 issues. But it was written by Denny O'Neil, and this was actually the last work that Denny O'Neil would do for this series. He had kind of quietly backed out of writing scripts for the monthly Shazam series some time ago, but he came back to write this little Isis crossover story to introduce readers to that character. The artwork for that story was provided by, by Dick Giordano. Right there it is.
There you go.
Yeah, and it really had a lot more to do with Isis and her supporting cast. Captain Marvel, it starts with Isis saving one of her students because her alter ego was teacher Andrea Thomas. We get like a page and a half recap of her origin in this story. Because Captain Marvel shows up. Andrea Thomas has just become Isis to save her student from a crumbling building at a demolition site. And Captain Marvel arrives on the scene just a little too late to be of any help, and he said, well, gosh, I'd like to know a little more about you, Isis, and how you got your amazing powers. And that prompts Isis to just stand there and think to herself, well, this is my origin. Which involved her being on an archaeological dig in Egypt and finding a magic amulet and a handy little instruction manual scroll that tells her how to use it to become Isis. And then Captain Marvel says, well, hope to be seeing more of you, Isis, and flies away, and that's pretty much the end of the Captain Marvel angle of that story. And then Isis spun off into her own series, and it didn't last very long, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Okay, so this issue was also the passing of the baton editorially, because the first that Isis story was edited by Julia Schwartz, but the second story of that issue, which is really much more relevant to Shazam, was edited by Joe Orlando. who would relieve Julie Schwartz as editor of the Shazam series, and none too soon as far as Julie was concerned, because he would later describe his time as Shazam editor as a low light of his career.
Jeez.
And probably not just because he had to deal with C.C. Beck, but I don't think he ever really warmed to the character and to the kind of warm, fuzzy nostalgia approach that was being taken to him.
Yeah, seems like the behind the scenes in general for this book was not exactly rosy.
Yeah, it was kind of embattled on some levels, I guess you could say. But it was far from the only DC publication or comics publication in general to suffer such behind the scenes problems.
Oh, yeah.
Bronze Age was a turbulent time.
And the other thing I'll point out is it's just because of the timing of as this was happening, over at Marvel, a title, went a couple of years of doing nothing but reprints, and then came back, strong and back and better than ever, and that was the X-Men. And now here's Shazam, going from being a quarterly reprint title back to being a regular book, right around the same time. So there you go.
Yep, there was a time of both hope and despair.
Yep.
So that's a good parallel to draw there, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. So then the back half of Shazam number 25 was a story called The Bicentennial Villain by E. Nelson Bridwell with art by Kurt Schaffenberger. And it was just Billy recording a piece for the Bicentennial with a focus on the role of young people in the American Revolution. And Dr. Sivana, because he's wicked, decides to sabotage this. He hates everything remotely patriotic. And it's in this story that no doubt is left, in anyone's mind, that Billy Batson and Captain Marvel call New York City their home. It's been kind of strongly hinted in the past, but now it's made pretty explicit. The generic city that Billy and Captain Marvel have been living in, it's been New York all along. So that's it's not Fawcett City, or at least it's not Fawcett City yet.
Okay.
It gets a little strange later on, but it's kind of a last minute revision was put into place to make it Fawcett City. But for now, it's definitely New York.
All right.
And so the Captain Marvel thwarts Sivana, but he gets away and threatens to try to do to the rest of the country, city by city, what he tried to begin in New York. So that's kind of the prologue for the new Filmation TV show influence direction that the title will be taking. And now another little interlude for something Captain Marvel related that was happening elsewhere in the DC line. And here's where I'm kind of sorry that Shane couldn't join us, because we're now going to be looking at an arc in the Justice League of America series. Mm-hmm. This is Volume 1, issues 135 through 137, published in the fall of 1976. This was the 14th annual team-up between the Justice League and the Justice Society, by then already a venerable DC annual tradition. And it marks the DC Comics debut of multiple non-Marvel family heroes from the Fawcett character library. So we get the first DC appearance of characters like Ibis the Invincible and his lovely wife Taya, the Spy Smasher, Bullet Man and Bullet Girl, and Mr. Scarlet and his sidekick Pinky. It's also the first DC appearance of the classic late Golden Age Captain Marvel villain King Kull the Beastman. And also, just for good measure, this story marks the first time, finally, that Captain Marvel's world is officially grounded and fully integrated into the DC Multiverse under the name Earth S. So I noticed this earlier today. If you look up DC's Parallel Earths on Wikipedia and a number of other places on the internet, it'll tell you that the name Earth S first appeared in Shazam number 1. I've read that comic multiple times now within the past few weeks. It ain't there.
Yeah.
Okay. Earth S was first officially used in this story arc, which was brought to us by, it's a story by E. Nelson Bridwell, again. The script was by Martin Pascoe, although, more behind-the-scenes drama. Pascoe's script was very heavily rewritten by E. Nelson Bridwell to the point of virtual unrecognizability, and that was to Martin Pascoe's heavy resentment. And he said that he considers that story an embarrassment, and to this day he has not reread it.
Oof.
And the pencils are provided by Dick Dillon as a part of his marathon run on the Justice League of America title. He was the regular penciler for that book for a long time. And not very many people mention it. But he got to draw a lot of classic Fawcett characters in this story.
Yeah, looking at the art, it's pretty standard, like Silver Age-esque Bronze Age stuff, if that makes any sense. It's
oh, sure.
Yeah, very, very, very much what you would expect each character to look like on the boilerplate is the way he drew the Justice League.
Yeah, just real style sheet type stuff.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so have you read this arc, Ian?
I haven't, but I'm flipping through it right now on the DC Universe app because it happens to be one of the titles that's actually there. So,
yeah, how about that?
Yeah, and it makes sense. I think they have most of the Justice League series on there versus the Shazam stuff. But looking through it right now, I love crossover titles and multiverse stuff in general. So I'm gonna add this to the list of stuff to read. And amazing that this was the 14th crossover already between the JLA and the JSA. When was the first one? How many years ago was that? Any idea?
Oh, well, probably 1962.
Yeah, so that's a decent amount of crossovers in a relatively short span.
Yeah, well, like I said, they made it kind of an annual family reunion between those two teams.
Yep.
And usually invited along a third party. And this time it just so happened to be the Fawcett heroes, collectively called in this story Shazam's Squadron of Justice.
Very cool.
Yeah. So the plot there, it's a really messy plot. I mean, editorial tampering will out in this case. And King Kull was the main villain, and his deal is he just wants to eradicate humanity because they eradicated his race of beastmen. So he finds his way to the Rock of Eternity. Despite being kind of a pre-human barbarian, he has access to all kinds of super science because his race, despite their affinity for loincloths, they were big into death rays and stuff. So he finds his way to the Rock of Eternity and holds all the elders hostage there, except for the one he's not able to capture is Mercury because he's too fast for him. So it's Mercury who goes to visit neighboring parallel Earths, Earth 1 and Earth 2, and gathers together teams of heroes from Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth S. And for some reason, they're dispatched to different Earths where King Kull has dispatched teams of villains from all three Earths to launch different schemes that King Kull has in mind for eradicating humanity in 3 different universes. It's not a very well-organized story. I mean, in fairness to me, the story itself is about as messy as my explanation is.
Well, I mean, I do see by the time we get to issue 137, that's when we do finally get the meeting between Superman and Captain Marvel that totally hasn't happened before, and they're absolutely meeting for the very first time.
Yep. It's the story we thought they'd never dare print.
Hey, exactly.
Except it isn't, because no fight actually takes place. Yeah. So it takes until the third part, the aforementioned number 137, when the Marvel family themselves finally get involved. It's been all JLA, JSA, and non-Marvel family Fawcett people to this point. But it all comes to a head on the Rock of Eternity. King Kull somehow has some Earth 1 red kryptonite in his possession, and he uses it to drive Superman violently insane so that he and Captain Marvel are about to have a big head-on collision, but instead, Captain Marvel just uses the old trick of saying his magic word at the last minute, and the magic lightning, I guess, shocks Superman back to his senses. Oh, and this is after, I nearly forgot this part, Johnny Thunder of the Justice Society, who is usually like the bumbling mascot of the team. He gets to play the hero here because he gets to use his magic thunderbolt to simulate the Shazam lightning. The reason the Marvel family haven't been involved so far is because the Shazam elders have been paralyzed by King Kull. They can't send the magic lightning to turn the kids into the Marvel family. So Johnny Thunder's magic thunderbolt gets to play magic lightning bolt, and he's able to transform them and bring them into the story. So there you go. That's the Marvel family and the Shazam, the Fawcett heroes' first big entry into the DC Multiverse, and they would be officially a part of the sandbox from that point on.
Very good to hear.
Something I forgot to mention earlier too. This is not the first time that E. Nelson Bridwell ticked off a creator with his very heavy rewrites. He was actually somewhat infamous for that, it seems.
Oh boy.
There's one anecdote about C.C. Beck, apparently sometime within a year after he walked off the Shazam series. Bridwell actually reached out to him, offering him an opportunity to write a Shazam script, and then, if it passed editorial muster, to draw it. And this is something that even back in the Golden Age, C.C. Beck did not very often do. Mm-hmm. There's only one issue of Whiz Comics I can think of that was both written and drawn by Beck. So Beck apparently was not steamed enough to turn down an offer like that, so he actually did write a Captain Marvel script involving the 7 deadly enemies of man, sent it in to the editorial offices, and like 6 months later it finally came back to him, edited so heavily that Beck barely recognized it, and he, of course, declined to draw it at that point. So.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
That's the way the cookie crumbles.
Shazam!
Okay, guys, so remember how at the beginning of the episode, Mr. Adam Murdo stated that we'd be able to get through this pretty quickly? Well, we recorded for 4 hours. So we're going to go ahead and cut this episode off here. And next episode, we'll have the rest of Captain Marvel in the Bronze Age. It's a great conversation all the way through. I love going back and forth with Mr. Murd, and we wind up talking about plenty of great Bronze Age action. So do tune in next episode for the rest of it. I'm sure you're going to love it as much as you love this part. And you're going to love this part, too, as I play the end credits. The website for Comic Geek Speak is comicgeekspeak.com, where you can check out any back episodes of the show you so desire. Voicemail line is 267-702-6642. Stop by thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com to discuss this or any other episode of the show. Twitter over at Comic Geek Speak, and Facebook at facebook.com/comicgeekspeak. We'd like to thank anybody who's donated to the show. We thank you very much and could not do it without you. And as always, we're uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time. Shazam, damn it!